"You don't look like you belong in first class." Those words would echo through Zara Chen's mind for the rest of her life, but not for the reasons anyone could have predicted when they first sliced through the humid air of JFK Terminal 4 on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July. At 22 years old, Zara had heard variations of that sentiment more times than she could count, but never quite so boldly, never quite so publicly, and never with such devastating consequences for the person who dared to speak them. The fluorescent lights above hummed with that particular frequency that seemed designed to give frequent travelers headaches, casting everything in the terminal with an artificial brightness that made even the most expensive designer luggage look cheap and garish. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the summer heat seeping through the massive windows that offered views of planes taxiing on the tarmac, their engines creating heat mirages that danced like ghosts across the concrete. Zara adjusted the straps of her battered canvas backpack, the one she'd carried through 4 years of art school at Parsons, its fabric now soft and faded from countless trips between her dorm and the studio spaces where she'd spent more nights than she cared to count. Her oversized gray hoodie hung loose around her shoulders, the hood pulled up over a mass of natural curls that had given up any pretense of cooperation in the July humidity, and she clutched a lukewarm coffee in a paper cup like it was the only thing keeping her upright after 3 consecutive all-nighters finishing her final thesis project. To anyone watching her navigate through the terminal, Zara looked exactly like what she was, an exhausted art student who had probably scraped together enough money for a standby economy ticket and was hoping against hope that she wouldn't get bumped from her flight home to London. Her sneakers were scuffed and splattered with dried acrylic paint in shades of blue and gold, evidence of the abstract piece that had consumed her life for the past month. And her jeans had seen better days with small tears at the knees that spoke of long hours spent crouched over canvases in cramped studio spaces. There were no Gucci logos adorning her luggage, no Louis Vuitton tote bag slung casually over her shoulder, no gleaming jewelry catching the harsh terminal lighting. Just Zara, tired and hungry and desperate to get home to the small apartment in Shoreditch that she shared with 2 other art students, where she could finally sleep in her own bed and eat something that hadn't come from a vending machine or a food cart parked outside the school. But appearances, as Zara had learned from her father, Vincent Chen, over the course of her 22 years, could be more deceptive than any work of abstract art she'd ever created. Vincent had built his airline empire, Skyward Airlines, from the ground up over the past 2 decades, transforming it from a small regional carrier into one of the world's most respected international airlines. And he had taught his daughter 2 fundamental principles that had shaped her entire worldview: never flash your wealth like a weapon, and never let anyone steal your dignity, no matter how powerless they think you are. Those lessons had been hard-won through Vincent's own experiences as a young man trying to make his way in the aviation industry, where his Chinese heritage and working-class background had made him a target for every kind of prejudice imaginable. He had endured snide comments about his accent, assumptions about his intelligence and treatment that made it clear he was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of opportunity he was thrown, and he had vowed that his daughter would grow up understanding both the privilege that his success had afforded her and the responsibility that came with that privilege. Zara remembered sitting in the kitchen of their London penthouse when she was 16, watching her father read newspaper articles about discrimination lawsuits against airlines, his jaw tight with controlled anger as he explained to her how easy it was for people in positions of power to abuse that power, how the simple act of wearing a uniform or standing behind a counter could transform ordinary people into gatekeepers who decided who deserved respect and who didn't. The moment you start believing that your worth is determined by the logo on your luggage or the price of your ticket. He had told her, his voice quiet but intense in the way that always made her pay attention, is the moment you lose sight of what actually matters in this world. We've been fortunate, Zara, but fortune is just luck wrapped up in hard work, and luck can change faster than the weather. What doesn't change is how we treat people when we think nobody important is watching, Those words had stuck with her through 4 years of art school, through countless interactions with classmates who came from families where money had never been a concern, through professors who made assumptions about her background based on her appearance, and through her own internal struggles with the guilt that came from knowing that her father's success meant she would never have to worry about student loans, or whether she could afford art supplies, or whether she'd have a safety net if her dreams of becoming a professional artist didn't work out. She had deliberately chosen to live like her classmates, to dress like them, to experience the same financial pressures they faced, because she wanted to earn her place in the art world through her talent and her work ethic, not through her father's connections or his ability to write checks to gallery owners. It was a noble intention born from genuine principles. But as she approached the gleaming silver counters of Skyward Airlines at JFK Terminal 4, Zara was about to discover that sometimes trying to hide your privilege can be just as dangerous as flaunting it. The terminal stretched out before her like a study in contrasts, divided into distinct worlds that might as well have been separated by oceans instead of velvet ropes and marble barriers. On her left, a serpentine line of hundreds of weary travelers snaked back and forth in the economy check-in area. Families with crying children and business travelers frantically checking their phones and college students with backpacks that looked suspiciously similar to her own, all of them sharing the particular brand of exhausted patience that comes with budget air travel. On her right, behind a thick velvet rope that gleamed under the artificial lights like a barrier between social classes, stretched a plush red carpet leading to a check-in counter that looked more like a piece of furniture from a billionaire's private office than anything that belonged in an airport. The mahogany surface was polished to a mirror shine, and the brass fixtures caught the light in a way that seemed calculated to intimidate anyone who might have thoughts above their station. A discreet brass plaque mounted on a chrome stand announced in elegant script, "Priority Access, First Class, Global Elite, Obsidian Members Only," and behind the counter stood a woman who looked like she had been hired specifically to embody those words. Her blonde hair lacquered into a helmet of such perfect immobility that it could probably survive a Category 5 hurricane without losing a single strand. Zara took a deep breath, tasting the recycled air and the faint scent of expensive perfume that seemed to drift over from the priority area, and stepped under the velvet rope with the quiet confidence that came from knowing, despite all appearances to the contrary, that she belonged there. She had every legal and moral right to walk across that red carpet, and her father had taught her that rights meant nothing if you weren't willing to exercise them, even when doing so made other people uncomfortable. What she didn't know as she approached that polished mahogany counter with her paint-stained sneakers silent against the plush carpet was that she was about to become the focal point of a confrontation that would destroy careers, topple corporate conspiracies, reshape an entire industry, and prove once again that the most dangerous thing anyone can do is underestimate the power of quiet dignity in the face of loud prejudice. The woman behind the mahogany counter possessed the kind of perfectly cultivated appearance that spoke of years spent perfecting the art of professional intimidation. Every detail of her presentation carefully calculated to establish and maintain the social hierarchy that had governed her corner of the aviation world for the better part of 2 decades. Her name tag, polished to the same mirror shine as the counter itself, read, "Melissa Hartwell," and those 2 words represented everything she had worked to achieve since the day she had first set foot in an airport as a terrified 19-year-old from a working-class family in Queens, who had never been on an airplane and wasn't entirely sure she ever wanted to be on one. Melissa's navy blue blazer was pressed to military precision, every button gleaming like a small medal, and her crisp white shirt looked like it had been starched with the kind of attention to detail that most people reserved for their wedding day. Her manicured nails, painted in a shade of red that perfectly matched the Skyward Airlines logo, drummed an impatient rhythm against the granite surface of the counter, and her makeup had been applied with such skill that it managed to look both natural and completely artificial at the same time, like a high-definition photograph of a person rather than an actual human being. But it was her smile that truly set her apart from her colleagues in the economy section, an expression that she had perfected through 15 years of dealing with passengers who she believed were either worthy of her attention or utterly beneath her notice. It was a smile that could transform from warm and welcoming to cold and dismissive faster than a pilot could flip a switch, and she wielded it like a weapon that never left fingerprints, never drew blood, but could inflict wounds that lasted for years. Melissa had grown up in a family where her mother cleaned office buildings at night and her father drove a delivery truck during the day, where money was always tight and luxuries were few and far between, where the idea of flying somewhere for vacation was about as realistic as the idea of taking a vacation on the moon. She had earned her way into the airline industry through a combination of hard work, natural intelligence, and a burning desire to surround herself with the kind of wealth and sophistication that had been completely absent from her childhood. The irony was that Melissa's background should have made her more sympathetic to people who found themselves out of place in expensive environments, more understanding of the anxiety that came with trying to navigate social situations where everyone else seemed to know rules that no one had ever bothered to explain to you. Instead, it had had exactly the opposite effect, transforming her into someone who guarded the gates of privilege with the zealousness of a recent convert. Someone who seemed to believe that the best way to prove she belonged in first class was to make sure that everyone who didn't belong stayed exactly where they were supposed to stay. She had been trained during her early years with Skyward Airlines to think of herself as a guardian of the brand, a protector of the company's reputation for exclusivity and excellence. Her supervisors had explained to her in terms that seemed reasonable at the time that part of her job was to ensure that the first-class experience remained special, that the passengers who paid premium prices for premium service continued to feel like they were getting something that was worth the extraordinary cost. You have to understand, her first manager had told her during a training session that now seemed like it had taken place in a different lifetime, that our first-class passengers aren't just buying a seat on an airplane. They're buying an experience, of feeling, of being special, of being treated like they matter more than everyone else. And that feeling is only valuable if everyone else doesn't get to have it. Your job is to make sure that the people who deserve that treatment get it, and the people who don't deserve it understand why they don't deserve it. It had seemed logical at the time, even noble in its own twisted way, like she was protecting something valuable and rare from being cheapened by people who hadn't earned the right to it. But over the years, that protective instinct had gradually transformed into something darker and more personal, a need to prove her own worth by diminishing the worth of others, a compulsion to exercise the small amount of power her position gave her over people who she perceived as threats to the carefully constructed world she had built for herself. Melissa surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a small-town mayor, contemplating a perfectly organized parade, taking inventory of every detail that contributed to the atmosphere of exclusivity she had worked so hard to create and maintain. The red carpet beneath her feet was vacuumed twice daily and steam cleaned once a week, ensuring that it maintained the kind of pristine appearance that made it clear this was a space where only certain kinds of feet were welcome to tread. The mahogany counter had been imported from a sustainable forestry operation in Honduras at a cost that exceeded most people's annual salary, and it was polished every morning with a special oil that enhanced the natural grain of the wood while providing a surface so smooth it felt almost liquid to the touch. The brass fixtures were cleaned with museum-quality care, and the lighting had been designed by the same firm that had done work for several five-star hotels in Manhattan, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously warm and intimidating. Behind her, arranged like trophies on glass shelves, were brochures advertising vacation packages to destinations that most people could only dream of visiting, private villa rentals in Tuscany and yacht charters in the Greek islands and safari expeditions in Kenya that cost more than most people made in several years. These weren't advertisements exactly, since the passengers who could afford such luxuries hardly needed to be convinced of their desirability, but rather symbols of a lifestyle that was available to some people and permanently out of reach for others. Melissa had memorized every detail of those brochures, partly because it was her job to be knowledgeable about the services her company offered, but mostly because she found comfort in studying the photographs of places she would probably never visit and experiences she would probably never afford even with her airline employee discounts. It was a complicated relationship she had with wealth, simultaneously worshiping it and resenting it, desperately wanting to be part of it while knowing that her role would always be to serve it rather than to possess it. The morning had been unusually quiet, with only a handful of first-class passengers checking in for the afternoon departure to London, most of them the kind of polished, confident people who moved through the world with the easy assurance that came from knowing that every door would open for them, and every smile would be genuine, and every experience would be tailored to their expectations. They were the kind of passengers Melissa enjoyed serving, not because she particularly liked them as individuals, but because their presence validated her belief that she was part of something important and exclusive. But now, as she watched a young woman in a paint-stained hoodie duck under the velvet rope and approach her counter with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she had no idea how out of place she looked, Melissa felt the familiar surge of protective anger that always arose when someone threatened to contaminate the sacred space she guarded so carefully. This was exactly the kind of situation her training had prepared her for, the kind of challenge to the natural order that required swift and decisive action to prevent the erosion of standards that separated the deserving from the undeserving. She straightened her blazer, arranged her face into the expression that she had perfected for dealing with people who needed to be put in their place, and prepared to defend her fortress against what was clearly an invasion by someone who had no business being there. The collision between Zara's quiet determination and Melissa's polished authority began with the kind of silence that seems to stretch time itself, a moment of assessment, where each woman took the measure of the other without saying a word, like gunfighters in an old Western movie sizing each other up before the shooting started. Zara stood at the edge of the red carpet, her paint-stained sneakers making no sound on the plush fabric, while Melissa remained behind her mahogany barricade, her perfectly manicured fingers frozen in mid-tap against the granite surface. "Excuse me," Melissa said finally, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Each syllable carefully modulated to convey just the right combination of politeness and condescension. It was a tone she had perfected over years of practice, one that managed to sound helpful, while actually being anything but like a smile with teeth that were just a little too sharp. "I think you might be looking for the economy check-in area, which is back in that direction." She gestured toward the chaotic mass of travelers on the left side of the terminal with the kind of dismissive wave that a queen might use to dispatch a particularly persistent peasant, her arm moving in a graceful arc that somehow managed to encompass not just the physical direction, but also the entire social hierarchy that separated the two sides of the terminal. Her eyes never quite met Zara's, directly focusing instead on a point somewhere over her left shoulder, as if looking at her would somehow contaminate the pristine atmosphere she had worked so hard to maintain. Zara paused in her approach, not because Melissa's words had intimidated her, but because she was genuinely curious about the psychology behind such immediate and confident assumptions. Here was a woman who had taken one look at her appearance and decided without any additional information that she must be lost, confused, or deliberately trying to gain access to something she didn't deserve. It was a fascinating example of the kind of unconscious bias her father had spent years trying to educate his employees about, though Zara suspected that, in Melissa's case, the bias was far from unconscious. "I know where the economy section is," Zara replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that comes from growing up in a household where every conversation was a master class in diplomacy and every dinner table discussion was a lesson in maintaining grace under pressure. "But I'm actually checking in for first class, flight 847 to Heathrow, departing at 3:15. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her phone, the screen already displaying the QR code that served as her boarding pass, its black background and silver lines marking it as something special even to casual observers. The Obsidian Pass was Skyward Airlines' highest tier of service, a level of luxury that was available to fewer than 50 people worldwide, most of them heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, and the kind of celebrities whose names appeared in newspapers on a daily basis. But Melissa barely glanced at the phone before shaking her head with the kind of patient exasperation that a kindergarten teacher might reserve for a child who insisted that 2 plus 2 equaled 5. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but something cold flickered behind her eyes like ice forming on a window during the first frost of winter. "Miss," she said, drawing the word out like she was speaking to someone who might have trouble understanding complex concepts. "This is the priority access area which is reserved for first-class passengers and global elite members only. I understand that sometimes the signage can be confusing, especially for people who aren't familiar with airline procedures, but I'm afraid you'll need to wait in the regular check-in line with the other economy passengers." She gestured again toward the serpentine queue on the other side of the terminal, her movement more emphatic this time, as if the additional force would somehow make her message clearer to someone she obviously considered too dense to understand it the first time. The implication was crystal clear. Not only did she not believe that Zara belonged in first class, but she was convinced that Zara was either lying about her ticket status or too stupid to understand the difference between the two sections. It was at precisely that moment that Theodore and Margaret Blackwood arrived at the priority counter, their presence announced by the soft wheeling of premium luggage across marble floors and the subtle cloud of expensive cologne that seemed to follow them like an invisible entourage. Theodore was a tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s who carried himself with the kind of unconscious arrogance that comes from a lifetime of having doors opened and problems solved by other people, while Margaret was an elegant woman whose pearl necklace probably cost more than most people's cars, and whose designer handbag was the kind of accessory that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. They approached the counter with the easy confidence of people who had never in their lives been told they didn't belong somewhere, and Melissa's entire demeanor transformed instantly like an actress switching between roles in the middle of a performance. The cold dismissiveness that she had directed toward Zara melted away, replaced by the kind of warm, genuine smile that she reserved for people she considered worthy of her best efforts. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice rising in pitch and warmth as she recognized the names from their reservation. "How wonderful to see you again. I hope your flight from Los Angeles was comfortable." Theodore nodded with the kind of casual acknowledgement that he might give to a particularly attentive waiter, while Margaret offered a smile that was polite but distant, the kind of expression that wealthy people had perfected for dealing with service workers who they wanted to encourage without actually engaging with as human beings. The flight was adequate, Theodore said, his voice carrying the slight undertone of dissatisfaction that suggested he was the kind of person who found fault with things as a matter of principle, rather than because anything was actually wrong. "Though I do hope the service on this afternoon's flight will be up to Skyward's usual standards. We're traveling to London for our anniversary, and Margaret has very specific expectations about how such occasions should be celebrated." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Melissa replied, her fingers already dancing across her computer keyboard as she pulled up their reservation details. "I see here that you've been upgraded to our premium first-class suite complimentary champagne service and priority deplaning upon arrival at Heathrow. Is there anything else I can do to ensure your journey is memorable?" Zara watched this exchange with the kind of detached fascination that an anthropologist might feel while observing a particularly interesting tribal ritual, noting how quickly and completely Melissa had shifted from hostile gatekeeper to obsequious servant, based on nothing more than the appearance and manner of the people she was dealing with. It was a perfect illustration of the point her father had been making about the arbitrary nature of respect and dignity in service industries, the way that human worth could apparently be calculated based on the cut of someone's clothes and the confidence of their bearing. "Excuse me," Zara said, stepping forward slightly to reclaim Melissa's attention, her voice still calm but carrying a slight edge that suggested her patience was beginning to wear thin. "I was in the middle of checking in for my flight, and I'd appreciate it if you could scan my boarding pass so I can get through security and find my gate." Melissa's head snapped back toward her with the kind of sharp movement that suggested genuine annoyance at having her important conversation with real customers interrupted by someone who clearly didn't understand her place in the hierarchy of the terminal. Her smile vanished completely, replaced by an expression of barely controlled irritation that made it clear she considered Zara's persistence to be a personal affront. "Miss," she said, her voice dropping to a temperature that could have frozen water, "I thought I made it clear that you need to move to the economy check-in area. This section is for paying customers only, not for people looking for upgrades or trying to sneak into first class with fake boarding passes printed from the internet." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Zara felt the familiar heat of anger rise in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her life, when people made assumptions about her based on nothing more than their own prejudices and limited worldviews. But she had learned from her father that anger without strategy was just noise, and noise was easily dismissed by people who had already decided not to listen. "I have a legitimate boarding pass," she said, holding her phone out toward Melissa with the kind of steady determination that suggested she was prepared to stand there all day if necessary. "I'm asking you to scan it and confirm my reservation, which is exactly what you're supposed to do for every passenger, regardless of what they're wearing or what assumptions you might be making about their economic status." Theodore Blackwood cleared his throat with the kind of theatrical emphasis that suggested he was accustomed to having his interruptions treated as important contributions to any conversation. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who believed that his age and social position gave him the right to lecture anyone he encountered. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to run here, but these dedicated professionals are trying to provide quality service to legitimate passengers. Perhaps you should consider finding your proper place in line before you cause any more disruption for people who actually belong here." Margaret nodded in agreement, her expression suggesting that she found Zara's presence not just inappropriate but personally offensive, like a stain on an expensive tablecloth or a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. "Honestly," she added, her voice carrying the kind of weary exasperation that suggested she encountered such problems on a regular basis. "The nerve of some people these days, thinking they can just demand special treatment without earning it." Zara looked back and forth between the three adults arrayed against her, taking in Melissa's hostile defensiveness, Theodore's pompous righteousness, and Margaret's casual disdain, and realized that she was witnessing something that went far deeper than simple customer service incompetence. This was a perfect example of the kind of institutional prejudice that her father had spent his entire career trying to eliminate from the airline industry, the belief that respect and dignity were commodities that had to be purchased rather than basic human rights that belonged to everyone, regardless of their economic status or social position. What none of them realized as they stood there in their perfect little bubble of privilege and prejudice was that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances and about the difference between actual power and the illusion of power that comes from wearing the right clothes and standing behind the right counter. The confrontation reached its tipping point when Melissa made the fatal decision to escalate from condescension to open accusation, crossing a line that would prove to have consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined in her worst nightmares. The terminal around them had grown quieter as other passengers began to sense the tension building at the priority counter, conversations dropping to whispers and phones being raised to capture what was obviously about to become a much more interesting situation than anything happening at the departure gates. "Listen, honey," Melissa said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that was somehow more insulting than outright hostility. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I can spot a fake boarding pass from 50 feet away. Printing out a QR code from some website and hoping nobody will notice doesn't make you a first-class passenger. It makes you a fraud who's wasting everyone's time with your pathetic attempt to get something you haven't earned." She reached across the counter with a quick, aggressive movement and plucked Zara's phone from her outstretched hand, holding it like it was a piece of evidence that had been contaminated by a crime scene. The gesture was so unexpected and so blatantly inappropriate that even Theodore Blackwood raised his eyebrows, though whether from surprise at Melissa's boldness or admiration for her thoroughness was impossible to determine. "Hey," Zara said, her voice sharper now as she reached toward her confiscated phone. "Give that back. You have no right to take my personal property." But Melissa had already turned away, placing the phone on a shelf behind the counter where it sat like a trophy from a successful battle against the forces of chaos and inappropriate ambition. "I'm confiscating this as evidence of attempted fraud," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, playing to her audience with the confidence of someone who believed she was performing a public service by exposing a scammer. "Security to gate 4, please." She continued, picking up the landline phone on her desk and speaking into it with the kind of dramatic authority that suggested she was reporting a terrorist threat rather than a disputed boarding pass. "We have a belligerent passenger who's refusing to leave the priority area and making threats against airline personnel. Please respond immediately." The word threats hung in the air like an accusation that could reshape reality through repetition, and Zara stared at Melissa with genuine disbelief at the audacity of the lie. She had done nothing more threatening than ask to have her legitimate boarding pass scanned, but somehow that simple request had been transformed in Melissa's retelling into a violent outburst that required law enforcement intervention. "I haven't threatened anyone," Zara said, her voice rising slightly as she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of such blatant dishonesty. "I asked you to do your job and scan my boarding pass, and you responded by stealing my phone and making up stories about things that never happened." Theodore Blackwood stepped closer to the counter, positioning himself as the gallant defender of civilized society against the forces of disorder and inappropriate dress codes. "Young woman," he said, his voice booming with the kind of theatrical authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his pronouncements treated as final judgments, "your behavior is completely unacceptable. This is a place of business, not a charity organization where you can demand handouts from hardworking professionals who are simply trying to maintain standards." Margaret nodded vigorously in agreement, clutching her designer handbag closer to her chest, as if Zara's presence posed a direct threat to her personal safety. "The entitlement is absolutely staggering," she added, her voice carrying the kind of moral outrage that suggested she considered herself a victim of Zara's alleged crimes against proper airport etiquette. "In my day, people understood their place and didn't try to force their way into situations where they clearly didn't belong." It was at that moment that the security officers arrived, two large men whose uniforms and equipment belts gave them the appearance of people who were prepared for much more serious situations than disputed boarding passes. The older of the two, whose name tag identified him as Officer Miller, approached the counter with the kind of weary professionalism that suggested he had dealt with similar situations many times before and was not particularly excited about dealing with another one. "What seems to be the problem here, Melissa?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he and the gate agent had worked together before and that he trusted her judgment about passenger-related issues. "Another upgrade scam." "I'm afraid so." Melissa replied, her voice heavy with the kind of disappointed sadness that suggested she was personally hurt by humanity's tendency toward deception and inappropriate ambition. "This individual has been trying to force her way onto the plane with what appears to be a counterfeit boarding pass, and when I asked her politely to move to the appropriate check-in area, she became verbally abusive and started making threats about what would happen if I didn't give her special treatment." Officer Miller turned toward Zara with the kind of tired expression that police officers develop after years of dealing with people who they assume are lying about whatever situation has brought them to official attention. His hand moved instinctively to his equipment belt, not reaching for any specific tool, but simply establishing his readiness to use whatever level of force the situation might require. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had delivered similar speeches hundreds of times and was not interested in having a long conversation about the details, "I need you to step away from the counter and move toward the economy check-in area. If you have a legitimate ticket for this flight, you can sort out any issues with the appropriate personnel over there." "I have a first-class ticket," Zara insisted, pointing toward the shelf where her phone sat, like evidence in a trial where she was the defendant and everyone else was both judge and jury. "My boarding pass is right there on my phone," which she took without permission after refusing to scan it. "All I'm asking for is the same service that any other passenger would receive," Miss Officer Miller said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to the kind of threatening whisper that was designed to make people understand that their cooperation was not optional. "I don't care if your daddy is the President of the United States. That doesn't give you the right to harass airline employees or cause disturbances in secure areas of the airport. Now, you can walk away voluntarily, or I can escort you out in handcuffs. Those are your only options." The threat was clear and immediate, and Zara realized that she had reached the point where any further resistance would result in her being physically removed from the terminal, possibly arrested, and definitely humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses who were already recording the encounter on their phones. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing curiosity and judgment and a kind of uncomfortable entertainment that people always seemed to derive from watching someone else's dignity being systematically destroyed. Theodore and Margaret Blackwood were watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased that the natural order of things was being restored through the proper application of authority and consequences. Melissa stood behind her counter with an expression of righteous vindication, convinced that she had successfully protected her domain from invasion by people who didn't understand or respect the rules that governed civilized behavior in premium spaces. "Fine," Zara said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper, as she realized that continuing to fight would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. "I'll leave, but I want my phone back." "The phone stays here as evidence pending a full investigation into possible criminal fraud," Melissa replied with obvious satisfaction, clearly savoring her complete victory over someone who had dared to challenge her authority. "You can file a police report downtown if you think you have grounds for a complaint, but I wouldn't recommend it since lying to federal officers is a felony." Officer Miller reached for Zara's arm with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was prepared to apply as much force as necessary to ensure her compliance with his instructions. But as his fingers closed around her bicep, a voice cut through the terminal noise with the kind of commanding authority that made everyone in the immediate vicinity freeze in place like actors who had suddenly forgotten their lines. "Officer Miller, take your hands off her immediately." The voice was deep and resonant, carrying the kind of natural authority that comes from years of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affect thousands of people's livelihoods, and it belonged to a tall, imposing man in an immaculate charcoal suit who had just emerged from the jetway leading to the private aircraft terminal, flanked by 2 assistants and the airport director himself. Vincent Chen had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that descended over Terminal 4 was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded earthquakes or tornadoes. A sudden absence of sound that made everyone instinctively understand that something significant was about to happen, and that they should probably prepare themselves for consequences they couldn't yet imagine. Officer Miller's hand froze in mid-grip on Zara's arm, his fingers loosening reflexively as his training kicked in and reminded him that when someone spoke with that level of natural authority, it was usually wise to listen before acting. Vincent Chen stood at the entrance to the jetway with the kind of commanding presence that seemed to bend the space around him, his 6'2" frame filling out his charcoal suit in a way that suggested both physical power and intellectual sophistication. His black hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his dark eyes held the kind of focused intensity that came from 2 decades of making decisions under pressure and accepting responsibility for their consequences. He was flanked by Arthur Pemberton, the airport director, whose nervous energy and obvious deference made it clear that Vincent was not just another passenger, but someone whose comfort and satisfaction were matters of serious institutional concern. Behind them walked 2 assistants carrying leather briefcases and tablets, their movements efficient and purposeful in the way that suggested they were accustomed to following someone whose time was measured in millions of dollars per hour. But it was Vincent's expression that truly commanded attention, a look of controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than any amount of shouting or dramatic gestures could have been. He surveyed the scene at the priority counter with the kind of methodical assessment that a general might use when examining a battlefield, where his troops had suffered unnecessary casualties, taking in every detail and filing away information that would undoubtedly be used to determine appropriate consequences for everyone involved. Melissa, who had been basking in her triumph over Zara just moments before, suddenly found herself facing a situation that her 15 years of customer service experience had not prepared her for. She recognized power when she saw it, but her understanding of hierarchies was based on appearance and behavior rather than actual authority, and she made the crucial mistake of assuming that Vincent was simply another wealthy customer whose travel experience was being disrupted by the unpleasantness at her counter. "Sir," she said, stepping out from behind her mahogany fortress and walking toward Vincent with her hand extended in what she probably thought was a gesture of professional courtesy. "I'm terribly sorry that you had to witness this unfortunate situation. We're handling it appropriately, and I assure you that this individual will be removed immediately so that our legitimate passengers can check in without further harassment or delay." Vincent ignored her outstretched hand completely, his eyes moving past her dismissive smile to focus entirely on Zara, who was still standing frozen between Officer Miller and the counter. Her face flushed with the kind of humiliation that comes from being publicly accused of crimes you didn't commit by people who refuse to listen to any evidence that contradicts their predetermined conclusions. He took in the details of her appearance with the kind of careful attention that a doctor might use when examining a patient for signs of serious injury, the way she was rubbing her arm where the security officer had grabbed her, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure, the defensive posture that indicated she had been made to feel like a criminal for the simple act of trying to check in for a flight she had every right to take. "Zara," Vincent said, his voice softening slightly but retaining the underlying steel that made it clear he was barely controlling his anger at what he was witnessing. "Are you all right?" The single word "Zara" fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond, creating ripples of confusion and growing awareness that spread outward through the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch what they had assumed was just another dispute between an unruly passenger and airport security. Melissa's extended hand wavered in the air as the implications of Vincent's familiar use of Zara's name began to sink in, and Officer Miller's grip on Zara's arm relaxed completely as he realized that he might be in the middle of a situation that was far more complicated than it had initially appeared. "Dad," Zara breathed the single word carrying a mixture of relief and embarrassment that spoke to the complicated emotions of a young adult who was grateful for rescue but uncomfortable with needing it, especially in such a public and humiliating context. The collective gasp that rose from the gathered crowd was audible enough to be heard over the ambient noise of the terminal and dozens of phone cameras that had been casually recording what they thought was an entertaining confrontation between a scammer and airport security, suddenly focused with laser-like intensity on what was clearly about to become a much more significant story. Dad, Melissa whispered the word, tasting like ash in her mouth, as she began to understand the magnitude of the mistake she had just made. She looked back and forth between Zara in her paint-stained hoodie and scuffed sneakers, and Vincent in his perfectly tailored suit and aura of unmistakable authority, trying to reconcile the obvious relationship between them with everything she thought she knew about social hierarchies and appropriate appearances. Theodore Blackwood, who had been so confident in his role as the defender of proper standards and appropriate behavior, suddenly found his voice stuck in his throat as he realized that the vagrant and scammer he had been so eager to see removed from the priority area was apparently the daughter of someone important enough to be personally escorted through the airport by the director himself. Arthur Pemberton, meanwhile, was looking at Melissa with the kind of horror that a museum curator might feel while watching someone use a priceless painting as a napkin, clearly calculating the potential damage to his career and his institution that might result from whatever had just transpired under his watch. Vincent walked slowly toward the priority counter, each step deliberate and measured, his movement creating a sense of inevitable consequence that made everyone in the vicinity understand that whatever was about to happen would be final and irreversible. He stopped directly in front of Melissa, who was now visibly sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning, and looked at her with the kind of cold assessment that she had spent years directing at passengers she deemed unworthy of her attention. "You told my daughter she didn't belong in first class," Vincent said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the entire gate area. "You accused her of fraud, confiscated her personal property, and called security to have her arrested. All because she was wearing comfortable clothes and asked you to do the job you're paid to do." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Melissa found herself unable to speak as the full scope of her mistake became clear. She had not just insulted a passenger. She had humiliated the daughter of someone who clearly possessed the kind of power that could destroy careers and ruin lives with a single phone call. But Vincent was not finished, and what he said next would ensure that this moment was remembered not just as a personal embarrassment for the people involved, but as the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape an entire industry's understanding of dignity, respect, and the true cost of prejudice. The transformation of Vincent Chen from concerned father to avenging angel of corporate justice began with a single question that cut through the pretense and politeness of airport customer service like a scalpel through silk. He stood before Melissa Hartwell with the kind of absolute stillness that predators display just before they strike his dark eyes, taking in every detail of her increasingly panicked expression as the implications of her treatment of Zara began to sink in with the weight of a collapsing building. Arthur Vincent said, without taking his eyes off Melissa, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was accustomed to having his questions answered immediately and completely. "Who is this woman, and how long has she been employed by my airline?" The words, "my airline," struck the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt, and Arthur Pemberton stepped forward with the nervous energy of someone who understood that his own career was suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. "This is Melissa Hartwell. Mr. Chen," he said, his voice carefully controlled but betraying the anxiety that was clearly eating him alive from the inside. "She's been with Skyward Airlines for 15 years, currently serving as senior gate agent for the priority access area." Vincent nodded slowly as if he was filing away information that would be used later for purposes that nobody wanted to contemplate too deeply. Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger as word spread through the terminal that something significant was happening at Gate 4, and the constant clicking of phone cameras created a subtle rhythm that underscored the historic nature of what they were witnessing. 15 years. Vincent repeated, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. 15 years of representing my company. 15 years of being trusted to provide the first impression that passengers receive when they encounter Skyward Airlines. 15 years of being paid to embody the values and principles that I have spent my entire adult life trying to build into this organization. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but Vincent held up a hand that silenced her as effectively as if he had physically covered her lips. "I built this airline." He continued, his voice rising slightly but maintaining the controlled precision that suggested he was choosing every word carefully for maximum impact on the principle that every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their ability to pay premium prices for premium service. He gestured toward the mahogany counter and velvet ropes that had served as Melissa's fortress against the unworthy masses. I created this priority area not to exclude people who couldn't afford first-class tickets, but to provide efficient service to passengers who needed expedited check-in procedures because of their travel schedules or special circumstances. The goal was never to create a caste system where human worth was determined by the price of an airline ticket. Theodore Blackwood, who had been so confident in his role as the defender of proper standards just minutes before, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of having supported discrimination against the daughter of the man who owned the airline they were all traveling on. He cleared his throat nervously, clearly hoping to distance himself from the situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. "Mr. Chen." He said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the potential consequences of his earlier behavior. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding, Mrs. Blackwood and I were simply trying to support your employee in maintaining appropriate standards for first-class service. We had no idea that the young woman was your daughter, and we certainly meant no disrespect to your family or your company." Vincent turned his attention to Theodore with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that suggested he was deciding exactly how much of his considerable power he wanted to bring to bear on someone who had revealed themselves to be not just prejudiced, but cowardly in the face of consequences for their prejudice. Mr. Blackwood Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that experienced negotiators learned to fear more than any amount of shouting or dramatic gesturing. "The fact that you didn't know she was my daughter is exactly the point. Your behavior toward her was based entirely on your assumption that she was powerless to defend herself against your prejudice and your need to demonstrate your superiority over someone you perceived as beneath your social station." Margaret Blackwood shrank back toward the wall, clutching her designer handbag like a shield against the verbal assault that was clearly coming their way, while Theodore's face cycled through a series of expressions that suggested he was rapidly recalculating his understanding of social hierarchies and power dynamics in light of this new information about who exactly he had been dealing with. "The fact that your behavior changed the moment you realized she had powerful family connections." Vincent continued his words, striking with the precision of a trained prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, proves that your concept of appropriate treatment is based entirely on self-interest and fear of consequences, not on any genuine belief in human dignity or proper behavior. He turned back to Melissa, who was now visibly shaking as she realized that her 15-year career was probably ending in the most public and humiliating way possible. "But you..." he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more intimidating than any amount of shouting could have been. "You are the most disappointing of all because you were specifically trained to represent the values of this company, and instead, you used your position to indulge your own prejudices and exercise petty power over people who you decided were unworthy of basic respect." Melissa finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Mr. Chen, please, I was just trying to protect the brand. I was following the procedures I was taught, maintaining the standards that make first-class service special. I didn't know she was your daughter, and if I had known, of course, I would have treated her differently." That Vincent said, his voice rising with genuine anger for the first time since the confrontation had begun, is exactly the problem. The fact that you would have treated her differently if you had known her identity proves that your default mode of operation is to disrespect and humiliate passengers based on your personal judgments about their worthiness, and only modify that behavior when you're afraid of consequences from people with power. He walked over to the counter where Zara's phone still sat on the shelf like evidence in a trial where everyone was guilty and no one was innocent. "You confiscated my daughter's personal property based on your assumption that she was attempting to commit fraud without bothering to scan the boarding pass that would have immediately confirmed her legitimate first-class reservation. You called security to have her arrested for the crime of asking you to do your job. And you did all of this while providing deferential service to passengers whose only qualification was that they met your personal criteria for what wealthy people should look like. Arthur Pemberton stepped forward again, clearly desperate to contain the damage before it spread beyond the immediate situation to encompass broader questions about airport management and airline oversight. Mr. Chen, I want you to know that this incident does not represent the standards or values of our airport authority, and we will be conducting a thorough investigation to ensure that appropriate corrective measures are taken. Vincent looked at him with the kind of tired disappointment that suggested he had heard similar promises many times before and had learned not to place much faith in bureaucratic assurances about investigations and corrective measures. Arthur, he said this incident represents exactly the standards and values of your airport authority, because it happened under your watch in your facility by employees who were hired and trained according to your procedures. The question is not whether this represents your values, but whether you're going to change those values or continue to enable discrimination as long as it doesn't create public relations problems. The crowd of onlookers had grown to include airport staff, other passengers, and several people who appeared to be reporters, drawn by the commotion and the obvious news value of whatever was unfolding at Gate 4. The clicking of cameras had intensified, and several people were clearly live-streaming the encounter to social media platforms that would ensure the story reached millions of people within hours. Vincent looked around at the assembled crowd, his expression suggesting that he was making calculations about publicity and consequences that went far beyond the immediate situation. When he spoke again, his words were clearly intended for a much larger audience than just the people standing in front of him. My daughter asked for nothing more than the service that any first-class passenger has a right to expect. He said, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal space and into the recording devices that would preserve his words for posterity. She was humiliated, accused of criminal behavior, and physically threatened by security officers, all because she didn't look like what these people thought a first-class passenger should look like. That is not just a failure of customer service. It is a betrayal of the fundamental principles that are supposed to govern how we treat each other in civilized society. But even as Vincent delivered what seemed like a concluding statement, everyone present could sense that this was just the beginning of something much larger and more consequential than a simple airport confrontation. The expression on his face suggested that he was already planning responses that would go far beyond firing employees or issuing public apologies, and the way he was looking at his phone indicated that forces were already being set in motion that would transform this personal humiliation into industry-wide change. The moment when Vincent Chen transformed from outraged father into forensic investigator began with the subtle gesture of pulling a slim, ultramodern tablet from his jacket pocket, the device's brushed titanium surface reflecting the harsh terminal lighting as he activated a screen that would soon reveal layers of deception and institutional corruption that no one present could have imagined. The tablet was no ordinary piece of consumer electronics, but rather a specialized device with direct access to Skyward Airline's entire operational network, a level of connectivity that was available to fewer than 5 people on the planet. Melissa Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of clinical detachment that surgeons used when discussing particularly complex operations. You claimed that my daughter's boarding pass was fraudulent, that she was attempting to gain access to first-class service through deception. I'd like you to tell me exactly what procedures you followed to verify that claim before you confiscated her personal property and called security. Melissa's face had taken on the pale, sweaty appearance of someone who was beginning to understand that her casual lies were about to be exposed by someone with the technological resources to verify every detail of her story. The system showed an error when I tried to scan the code, she said, her voice wavering as she realized that her usual repertoire of customer service deflections was inadequate for the situation she now found herself in. The system showed an error. Vincent repeated, his fingers dancing across the tablet's surface with the kind of fluid expertise that came from years of using technology to solve complex business problems. That's interesting, because I'm looking at the back-end logs for Terminal 4's check-in system right now, and according to the data, you never attempted to scan her boarding pass at all. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and the crowd of onlookers pressed closer to hear what was clearly becoming a real-time investigation into corporate malfeasance and employee misconduct. Vincent held up the tablet so that its screen was visible to the cameras that were recording every word, displaying a complex interface filled with timestamps, user IDs, and transaction logs that told a story very different from the one Melissa had been trying to sell. Here, Vincent continued pointing to specific entries on the screen with the kind of precise gestures that professors used when explaining crucial concepts to particularly slow students. We can see every interaction with the passenger manifest system over the past 3 hours. At 1:42 p.m., user IDM Hartwell accessed the reservation for passenger Chen Zara seat assignment 1A. Instead of scanning her boarding pass to confirm her identity, you manually flagged the reservation as no-show and released the seat back into the available inventory. Melissa's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish that had been pulled from water and was desperately trying to breathe air that provided no oxygen for her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her version of events. Around her, the other players in this drama were beginning to understand that they had been witness to something far more serious than a simple customer service dispute. But that's not the most interesting part, Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of professional fascination that suggested he was genuinely impressed by the scope of the deception he was uncovering. The really fascinating detail is what happened 30 seconds later when the same user ID processed a complimentary operational upgrade for passengers, Blackwood Theodore and Blackwood Margaret, moving them from business class seats 12A and 12B to first class seat 1A. Theodore Blackwood made a choking sound that suggested he was beginning to understand the legal and financial implications of what Vincent was describing, while Margaret took an involuntary step backward as if physical distance from the computer terminal could somehow protect her from the consequences of what they had apparently participated in. A complimentary operational upgrade. Vincent continued, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to his topic, which according to Skyward Airline's policy can only be authorized in cases of aircraft equipment changes, passenger medical emergencies, or other extraordinary circumstances that require immediate seat reassignments. None of those conditions applied to this afternoon's flight, which means that this upgrade was processed in direct violation of company policy. Arthur Pemberton was frantically taking notes on his own device, clearly trying to document every detail of what was turning into a federal case study in airline fraud and discrimination, while Officer Miller stood frozen in place like a man who had suddenly realized he had been about to arrest the daughter of someone who could end his career with a single phone call. But here's where it gets really interesting, Vincent said, scrolling through additional screens of data with the kind of methodical thoroughness that suggested he was building a case that would be presented in courts and congressional hearings, because complementary operational upgrades are supposed to be processed through the corporate revenue management system, which automatically adjusts pricing and availability across the entire network. But this upgrade was processed as a local terminal adjustment, which means it bypassed all the normal oversight and audit procedures. He looked up from the tablet to focus his attention on Melissa, whose face had now progressed beyond pale to a sickly green color that suggested she might actually be physically ill from the stress of having her deception exposed in such devastating detail. That kind of local adjustment, Vincent continued, can only be justified if there was some form of compensation provided to offset the revenue loss from giving away a $12,000 seat for free. So I'm very curious to know, Melissa, what compensation you received for facilitating this unauthorized upgrade. The question hung in the air like a trap that had been carefully constructed and was now ready to spring shut on anyone foolish enough to step into it. Melissa looked around desperately, clearly hoping that someone in the crowd would provide her with an escape route from the technological noose that was tightening around her professional neck. I didn't receive any compensation, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she realized that every word she spoke was being recorded by dozens of devices and would probably be analyzed by federal investigators before the day was over. It was just a courtesy upgrade for valued customers who deserved better service than they were receiving in business class. Vincent smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, but it was not the kind of smile that suggested humor or warmth. It was the expression of a chess player who had just maneuvered his opponent into checkmate and was about to demonstrate exactly how thorough the defeat had been. "That's fascinating," he said, "because according to the data I'm looking at, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood's original business class reservation was purchased with a corporate discount through Blackwood Automotive Group, and their travel history shows no previous first-class bookings with Skyward Airlines. So by what criteria did you determine that they were valued customers who deserved better service?" Theodore Blackwood was now visibly sweating, clearly understanding that his casual participation in what he had assumed was simply a pleasant upgrade was about to be reclassified as participation in fraud conspiracy, and possibly federal aviation crimes that carried penalties he had never bothered to research, because he had never imagined he would need to know about them. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain dignity while his world collapsed around him. "I want you to understand that my wife and I had no knowledge of any improper procedures. We were simply grateful for what we assumed was excellent customer service, and we certainly never intended to participate in anything illegal or unethical." Vincent looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he was evaluating a particularly weak excuse from a student who had been caught cheating on an important exam. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "are you telling me that you believe it's normal for airlines to upgrade passengers from business class to first class for free, with no explanation and no documentation, simply because a gate agent decides that you look like people who deserve special treatment?" The rhetorical question exposed the absurdity of Theodore's position and made it clear that whatever had transpired at the priority counter had been understood by all parties to be irregular, even if they had chosen not to examine the irregularities too closely when they were benefiting from them. But Vincent was not finished with his technological investigation, and what he revealed next would transform this airport confrontation from a case of customer service misconduct into evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Melissa Hartwell's petty prejudices and small-time corruption. The revelation that would transform this confrontation from a simple case of discrimination into evidence of corporate espionage began when Zara stepped forward, her artist's eye having noticed details that everyone else had missed in the chaos of accusations and denials swirling around the priority counter. Despite the humiliation she had endured and the ongoing public spectacle of her vindication, her mind had been working through the sequence of events with the kind of analytical precision that her father had always encouraged her to apply to complex problems. "Dad," she said, her voice cutting through Vincent's methodical destruction of Melissa's credibility with a note of urgency that made everyone present understand that she had observed something significant. "There's something you need to know about what happened before the Blackwoods even arrived at the counter." Vincent paused in his technological investigation, his attention shifting to his daughter with the kind of focused interest that suggested he had learned over the years to take her insights seriously, even when they came from unexpected directions. The crowd of onlookers, which had grown to include airport security personnel, airline staff, and several people who were clearly journalists, drawn by the newsworthiness of the unfolding drama, pressed closer to hear what additional bombshells might be about to explode. "When Melissa first refused to scan my boarding pass," Zara continued, her voice gaining strength as she realized that her observations might be crucial to understanding the full scope of what had happened to her. "I noticed her reaching for her phone and typing a text message. It seemed strange at the time because she was supposed to be helping me, but she was clearly communicating with someone else instead." Melissa's face, which had already progressed through several stages of panic and desperation, now took on the appearance of someone who had just realized that their carefully constructed web of deception was about to collapse entirely. She opened her mouth to speak clearly, intending to deny Zara's accusation, but Vincent held up a hand that silenced her before she could utter a word. "That's very interesting," Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of professional curiosity that suggested his years of running a major corporation had taught him to recognize the patterns that indicated when isolated incidents were actually part of larger conspiracies. Because if Melissa was texting someone about your arrival before she had even attempted to verify your reservation, that would suggest a level of coordination that goes far beyond simple customer service incompetence. He turned his attention back to his tablet, his fingers moving across the screen with renewed purpose as he accessed systems and databases that were clearly far beyond the reach of ordinary airport personnel. "Arthur," he said without looking up from his device, "I'm going to need immediate access to all communication records for Terminal 4 staff over the past 4 hours. Every text message, every phone call, every email that was sent or received by anyone working in this area." Arthur Pemberton nodded with the kind of nervous enthusiasm that suggested he understood that his cooperation with Vincent's investigation was probably the only thing standing between him and a very unpleasant conversation with federal aviation authorities about oversight failures and security breaches. "Of course, Mr. Chen," he said, pulling out his own phone and beginning to make the calls that would provide Vincent with access to communication data that most people didn't even know was being routinely collected and stored. "But we don't need to wait for official records." Vincent continued, his voice taking on a note of satisfaction that suggested he had found something significant in the data streams he was accessing, because I have real-time access to all cellular communications that pass through the airport's network infrastructure. It's a security feature that most passengers don't know about, but it's essential for preventing terrorist communications and other threats to aviation safety. The implications of what Vincent was describing sent a visible shudder through the crowd of onlookers as they realized that their own phone communications were apparently being monitored and recorded every time they passed through the airport, but the immediate focus was on what those records might reveal about Melissa's activities during the crucial period when Zara had been approaching the priority counter. "Here we are," Vincent said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just confirmed a suspicion that he had hoped would prove to be unfounded. "At 1:41 p.m., 1 minute before you accessed Zara's reservation, you sent a text message from your personal phone to a number registered to a prepaid account. The message reads, 'Target acquired, Phase 1 initiated.'" The words fell into the silence like stones thrown into a deep well, and everyone present could hear the echoes of implications that reached far beyond anything they had initially understood about this situation. Melissa made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, clearly realizing that her text messages had just been exposed to a crowd of witnesses and recording devices that would ensure her words became part of the permanent public record. "Target acquired." Vincent repeated, his voice heavy with disappointment and growing anger as he began to understand the full scope of what had been done to his daughter. "Suggests that my daughter's arrival at this counter was not an unexpected encounter, but rather an anticipated event that you had been specifically instructed to watch for and respond to in a particular way." Theodore Blackwood took several steps backward, clearly understanding that he and his wife had somehow become unwitting participants in what was apparently a planned operation designed to humiliate and discredit someone who these conspirators had specifically targeted for reasons that were still unclear, but obviously went far beyond simple customer service disputes. But that's not all. Vincent continued scrolling through additional screens of communication data with the kind of methodical thoroughness that suggested he was building a comprehensive case that would eventually be presented to people with the power to impose serious consequences on everyone involved. At 1:50 p.m., 9 minutes after you sent that first message, you received a reply from the same number. The message reads, "Make it ugly, we need footage." The phrase, "we need footage," struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow as everyone present realized that Zara's humiliation had not been an unfortunate accident, or even simple prejudice, but rather a carefully orchestrated performance designed to create a specific kind of public spectacle for reasons that were still unclear, but obviously sinister. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the airport's aggressive air conditioning as she realized that her treatment at the priority counter had been planned in advance by people who had wanted her to be publicly humiliated and had specifically instructed Melissa to ensure that the confrontation would be dramatic enough to attract attention and recording devices. "Someone wanted this confrontation to be recorded," Vincent said, his voice rising as the full implications of the conspiracy began to sink in. "Someone wanted my daughter to be publicly humiliated and accused of fraud. Someone wanted footage of her being dragged away by security officers. This wasn't discrimination born of ignorance or prejudice. This was a deliberate attack designed to damage her reputation and, by extension, mine." Arthur Pemberton was frantically taking notes, clearly understanding that what had started as a customer service issue in his facility had transformed into evidence of a criminal conspiracy that would require federal investigation and could potentially result in terrorism charges for anyone involved in planning or executing attacks on aviation industry figures. The question, Vincent said, looking around at the crowd of witnesses and recording devices that would ensure his words reached far beyond the confines of Terminal 4, is who sent those messages and why they wanted my daughter to be publicly humiliated in a way that would inevitably reflect poorly on Skyward Airline's reputation and my leadership of the company. But even as Vincent asked that question, his expression suggested that he already had suspicions about the answers, and that the investigation he was conducting in real time was about to reveal connections and motivations that would transform this airport confrontation into the opening salvo of a corporate war that would have consequences reaching far beyond anything anyone present could have imagined. The moment when Vincent Chen transitioned from investigator to corporate warrior began with a gesture so subtle that most of the onlookers missed its significance entirely. A simple touch of his finger to a specific icon on his tablet that activated systems and protocols that had been designed for exactly this type of extraordinary situation. The icon was unmarked and unlabeled, hidden among the standard applications that any executive might carry. But when Vincent pressed it, alerts began cascading through computer networks across 3 continents as Skyward Airline's most powerful emergency procedures roared to life. "Protocol Thunderbolt is now active," Vincent announced, his voice carrying across the terminal with the kind of authority that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented and irreversible. Which means that every Skyward Airlines operation worldwide has just received an immediate stand-down order pending completion of a comprehensive security audit of all passenger-facing personnel and procedures. The words struck the assembled crowd like a thunderclap, and Arthur Pemberton's face went white as he began to calculate the implications of what Vincent was describing. If Skyward Airlines had just suspended all operations globally, the financial and logistical consequences would be measured in tens of millions of dollars per hour, affecting hundreds of thousands of passengers and threatening the stability of international air travel networks that depended on Skyward's connectivity and capacity. "Mr." Chen Arthur said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain professional composure while his world collapsed around him. "Surely there's no need to ground the entire airline over what appears to be an isolated incident involving a single employee. The disruption to passengers and the economic impact on the aviation industry would be catastrophic." Vincent looked at him with the kind of cold assessment that suggested he was evaluating not just Arthur's immediate concerns, but also his fundamental understanding of corporate responsibility and institutional accountability. "Arthur," he said, "this is not an isolated incident. This is evidence of a coordinated attack on my family and my company carried out by people who clearly had inside information about my daughter's travel plans and access to airport personnel who were willing to participate in a conspiracy designed to create public humiliation and corporate embarrassment." As he spoke, Vincent's tablet began displaying a cascade of real-time data that illustrated the scope of the operation he had just launched with a single touch. Flight status boards across the world were updating to show Skyward Airlines departures being delayed or canceled. Ground crews were receiving orders to suspend all passenger boarding procedures, and crisis management teams in a dozen countries were being activated to handle the logistical nightmare of coordinating alternative transportation for displaced passengers. Protocol. Thunderbolt Vincent continued his voice, taking on the tone of someone who was explaining complex technical procedures to people who had never needed to understand them before, is designed to respond to threats against Skyward Airline's operational integrity that require immediate and comprehensive response. It provides me with real-time access to every computer system, every communication network, and every data stream that touches our operations anywhere in the world. Melissa was now visibly shaking as she realized that her participation in what she had probably thought was a relatively minor scheme had somehow triggered a global corporate emergency that would affect millions of people and cost countless millions of dollars to resolve. The idea that her few text messages and unauthorized upgrade could have such far-reaching consequences was clearly beyond anything she had imagined when she had agreed to participate in whatever conspiracy had led to this moment. "The communication logs you accessed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she made a desperate attempt to limit her legal exposure. "I don't know who sent me those messages. Someone just told me to watch for a young woman matching your daughter's description, and to make sure that any attempt by her to use first-class services resulted in a public confrontation that would be recorded and shared on social media." Vincent's expression didn't change, but everyone present could sense that Melissa's partial confession had confirmed suspicions that had been building in his mind since the moment he had arrived at Terminal 4 and witnessed his daughter being humiliated by people who should have been providing her with professional service. "Someone told you to watch for my daughter. Specifically." Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of dangerous calm that suggested he was processing information and calculating responses that would have consequences far beyond anything visible in the immediate airport environment, which means that whoever orchestrated this attack had advanced knowledge of her travel plans, access to airport personnel willing to commit criminal acts on command, and a sophisticated understanding of how to create viral social media content designed to damage corporate reputations. Arthur Pemberton was frantically working his own phone, clearly trying to contact federal aviation authorities and airport security personnel who could provide some kind of framework for dealing with a situation that had escalated far beyond anything covered in standard emergency response procedures. The idea that a major international airport was hosting evidence of a criminal conspiracy directed against one of the world's largest airlines was the kind of crisis that kept aviation administrators awake at night in cold sweats. "But, protocol, Thunderbolt doesn't just shut down operations." Vincent continued, his fingers dancing across his tablet's surface with the kind of fluid expertise that suggested he had planned for exactly this type of situation and had prepared tools specifically designed to respond to it. "It also activates our most sophisticated investigation and analysis systems, which are currently pulling data from every source connected to Skyward Airlines' network infrastructure." The tablet's screen began displaying streams of information that flowed too quickly for most observers to follow, but Vincent's expression suggested that he was seeing patterns and connections that were providing him with a clear picture of the scope and nature of the conspiracy that had targeted his daughter. Flight manifests, communication records, financial transactions, and personnel files were being cross-referenced and analyzed by artificial intelligence systems that had been designed to detect exactly the kinds of coordinated attacks that Vincent suspected were behind the day's events. Passenger manifest analysis shows that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood's business class reservations were purchased using a corporate credit card belonging to a shell company that has been involved in several previous incidents of passenger complaints and airline disputes. Vincent announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who was watching a complex puzzle resolve itself into a clear and damaging pattern. Financial transaction records show that the same shell company has made payments to airport personnel at 6 different international terminals over the past 18 months. Theodore Blackwood made a choking sound that suggested he was beginning to understand that his participation in what he had assumed was a simple upgrade had actually made him a participant in an international conspiracy. involving multiple airports, numerous airline personnel, and financial networks that were clearly designed to conceal criminal activity from regulatory oversight. Communication analysis has identified the phone number that sent instructions to Melissa. Vincent continued, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury that would soon be asked to render a verdict on guilt and innocence. The number is registered to a prepaid account that was purchased with cash at a London electronics store, but geolocation data shows that the phone was physically present at the Kensington penthouse belonging to Carter Fleming, my chief financial officer at the time the messages were sent. The revelation struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow as everyone present realized that what had appeared to be a simple case of airport discrimination had actually been the visible tip of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Skyward Airlines corporate leadership and involved coordinated attacks on the company's founder and CEO by someone with intimate access to corporate information and operational procedures. Vincent's expression had shifted from anger to something much more dangerous, as he began to understand that his daughter's humiliation had been orchestrated by someone he had trusted with the financial operations of his company, someone who had access to travel schedules and operational data that could be used to coordinate exactly the kind of attack that had just been executed against his family. Carter Fleming. Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of personal betrayal that suggested he was recalculating not just professional relationships, but also personal judgments about people. He had considered friends and allies who has been planning a vote of no confidence in my leadership that is scheduled to be presented to the board of directors next week, apparently decided that my daughter's public humiliation would provide useful ammunition for his argument that I am unfit to continue leading this company. But even as Vincent revealed the personal and professional motivations behind the conspiracy that had targeted his family, his expression suggested that Carter Fleming had made a fundamental miscalculation about the resources and determination that would be brought to bear in response to his attack, and that the consequences of this corporate warfare were about to extend far beyond anything that could be contained within boardroom politics and shareholder disputes. The cascade of consequences that followed Vincent's activation of Protocol Thunderbolt began with the arrival of federal agents who had been automatically dispatched to Terminal 4 the moment Skyward Airlines' security systems had flagged the situation as a potential threat to aviation safety and corporate infrastructure. The agents moved through the terminal with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested they had been briefed on the situation during their rapid response to what their initial reports had classified as a possible terrorist incident involving coordinated attacks on airline personnel and operations. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Aviation Crimes Unit approached Vincent with her credentials already visible, and her expression suggesting that she understood she was dealing with a situation that could have international implications for aviation security and corporate crime enforcement. Behind her walked a team of investigators whose equipment and demeanor made it clear that they were prepared to treat Terminal 4 as an active crime scene requiring immediate preservation of evidence and witness testimony. "Mr. Chen," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that federal agents reserved for people whose cooperation was essential to their investigations, but whose power and influence required careful handling. "We received an automated alert from your company's security systems indicating a possible coordinated attack on Skyward Airlines operations. We're going to need to interview everyone involved and collect all available evidence before we can determine the appropriate federal charges." Vincent nodded with the kind of calm satisfaction that suggested he had anticipated exactly this response and had designed Protocol Thunderbolt specifically to ensure that situations like this would receive immediate federal attention rather than being relegated to local law enforcement agencies that might lack the resources or jurisdiction to handle complex corporate crimes. Agent Martinez. He said, "I have comprehensive documentation of a conspiracy involving airport personnel, corporate espionage, and coordinated attacks on airline passengers designed to damage Skyward Airlines' reputation and create material for a corporate takeover attempt. The evidence includes communication records, financial transactions, and real-time testimony from the perpetrators themselves. Melissa Hartwell was now crying openly as she realized that what she had probably thought was a relatively minor violation of airport policies had somehow escalated into a federal investigation that would likely result in charges carrying penalties that could destroy her life and the lives of her family members. The idea that her text messages and unauthorized upgrade procedures were being treated as evidence of terrorism and corporate sabotage was clearly beyond anything she had imagined when she had agreed to participate in whatever scheme had led to this moment. "I want to cooperate fully," she said, her voice breaking as she addressed Agent Martinez with the kind of desperate sincerity that suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of the legal consequences she was facing. "I received instructions from someone I didn't know, telling me to watch for a specific passenger and create a public confrontation that would be recorded and shared on social media. I was told it was just a corporate security test, not a criminal conspiracy." Agent Martinez nodded and gestured to one of her colleagues, who immediately began reading Melissa her Miranda rights, while other team members started photographing the priority counter area and collecting physical evidence that would be needed for whatever federal prosecution eventually resulted from the investigation that was now underway. Theodore and Margaret Blackwood were standing pressed against the wall, like people who were hoping that maintaining perfect stillness would somehow make them invisible to federal agents who were clearly interested in their role in the evening's events. Theodore's face had taken on the appearance of someone who was mentally reviewing his entire financial and legal situation while trying to calculate how much of his wealth would survive the kind of federal investigation that was clearly about to consume his life. "Mr. and Mrs." Blackwood Agent Martinez said, turning her attention to the couple who had been so eager to support Melissa's discrimination against Zara just minutes before. "We're going to need you to remain available for questioning regarding your participation in fraudulent airline transactions and your knowledge of the conspiracy to defame Skyward Airlines passengers and operations." "We had no knowledge of any conspiracy," Theodore said, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while federal agents documented his participation in what was apparently a complex criminal enterprise. "We were simply passengers who were offered an upgrade that we assumed was legitimate customer service." Agent Martinez looked at him with the kind of expression that federal investigators reserved for people whose explanations were either willfully naive or deliberately deceptive. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "the evidence shows that you participated in verbal attacks on Miss Chen, supported airport personnel who were discriminating against her, and encouraged security officers to physically remove her from the terminal. That behavior, combined with your acceptance of fraudulent upgrades, suggests a level of coordination that we'll need to investigate thoroughly." Meanwhile, Vincent's tablet was continuing to display real-time updates on the global consequences of Protocol Thunderbolt, showing flight delays and cancellations cascading through international aviation networks, as Skyward Airlines' suspended operations created ripple effects that would be felt by millions of passengers and thousands of businesses that depended on air transportation for their daily operations. "The financial cost of this investigation," Vincent announced, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal area where dozens of people were recording every word for social media platforms that would ensure his message reached audiences far beyond the immediate witnesses, "will be charged directly to the accounts of the individuals and organizations responsible for orchestrating the attack on my daughter and my company. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood will be personally liable for the costs of grounding international flight operations, investigating corporate espionage, and compensating passengers who have been displaced by this criminal conspiracy." Margaret Blackwood made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob as she realized that her participation in what she had thought was simply defending appropriate social hierarchies had somehow made her financially responsible for the operational costs of a major international airline and the investigation expenses of a federal criminal case. "The upgrade we received?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of federal agents setting up interview stations and evidence collection procedures throughout the gate area. It wasn't worth more than a few $1,000s. How can we be responsible for millions of dollars in airline operations? Vincent looked at her with the kind of cold assessment that suggested he was calculating not just financial liability, but also the broader implications of holding people accountable for the full consequences of their actions, rather than just the immediate benefits they had received from their participation in criminal activities. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "when you participated in a conspiracy to defraud airline operations and attack airline passengers, you became legally liable for all the foreseeable consequences of that conspiracy, including the costs of responding to the security threats it created and the operational disruptions it caused. The fact that you only intended to receive a free upgrade doesn't limit your liability for the federal crimes you helped commit." But even as Vincent explained the legal consequences that were about to transform Theodore and Margaret Blackwood from wealthy travelers into defendants in a federal criminal case, his expression suggested that the revelation of their involvement was just a small part of a much larger investigation that would soon focus on the corporate executives who had orchestrated this attack and the institutional changes that would be needed to prevent similar conspiracies from succeeding in the future. Arthur Pemberton approached Agent Martinez with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was desperate to demonstrate his cooperation with the federal investigation before anyone decided that his oversight failures had contributed to the security breaches that had enabled this conspiracy to unfold in his facility. "Agent Martinez," he said, "I want you to know that the airport authority had no knowledge of any conspiracy involving our personnel or facilities, and we are prepared to provide complete access to all communication records, security footage, and personnel files that might be relevant to your investigation." Agent Martinez nodded, with the kind of professional acknowledgement that suggested she appreciated cooperation, but was not necessarily prepared to assume that institutional ignorance was the same thing as institutional innocence when it came to security failures that had enabled criminal conspiracies to operate within federal aviation facilities. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, "will be conducting a comprehensive review of airport security procedures and personnel oversight protocols to determine whether systemic failures contributed to the ability of criminal conspirators to coordinate attacks on airline passengers and operations. Your cooperation will be noted, but the scope of our investigation will depend on the evidence we collect, not on assurances about institutional innocence." Vincent's phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from Skyward Airline's corporate headquarters in London, and his expression as he answered suggested that the conversation he was about to have would determine whether the corporate warfare that had targeted his daughter would escalate into the kind of executive-level confrontation that could reshape the airline industry's approach to internal security and leadership accountability. "This is Vincent Chen," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that the people responsible for attacking his family would face consequences that would serve as permanent deterrents to anyone else who might consider similar strategies for corporate advancement. The private jet that carried Vincent and Zara back to London was a marvel of modern aviation engineering, with a cabin that had been designed to serve as both a mobile office and a sanctuary from the kind of high-stakes corporate warfare that had just erupted in Terminal 4. The leather seats were arranged around a conference table that could accommodate board meetings at 40,000 feet, and the communication systems provided encrypted connectivity to every major business center in the world. But as they climbed through the clouds above New York, neither Vincent nor Zara was paying attention to the luxury that surrounded them. Vincent sat across from his daughter with his laptop open and 3 phones within easy reach, coordinating a response to the conspiracy that had targeted his family with the kind of methodical precision that had made him one of the most successful executives in the aviation industry. His expression was calm but focused, like a general planning a campaign that would determine the future of his empire and the safety of everyone who depended on his leadership for their livelihoods and security. The forensic accountants are already in Carter's office," Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction as he updated Zara on the rapid deployment of resources that was following their departure from JFK, and the board has been called into emergency session to review the evidence of embezzlement and corporate sabotage that we collected at the airport. By the time we land in London, Carter Fleming will be facing federal charges in 2 countries and civil liability that will probably exceed his net worth by several orders of magnitude. Zara nodded, but her attention was focused on her laptop, where she was using her artistic training to analyze patterns in financial documents that her father's forensic teams had forwarded to the aircraft's communication systems. Her experience with visual composition and color theory had given her an unusual ability to spot inconsistencies and connections that traditional financial analysis might miss. And what she was seeing in Carter Fleming's expense reports and communication patterns was beginning to reveal a conspiracy that was far more extensive than even Vincent had initially suspected. "Dad?" She said, her voice carrying a note of excitement as she highlighted sections of financial data that showed recurring patterns of suspicious transactions. "I think Carter's conspiracy against you goes back much further than just this week's board meeting. Look at these expense reports from the past 18 months. He's been traveling to meet with Melissa and other airport personnel across 3 continents, always paying cash, always timing his visits to coincide with high-profile passengers who later experienced exactly the kind of discrimination I face today." Vincent leaned over to examine the documents that Zara had arranged on her screen, his expression shifting from focused anger to something approaching admiration as he realized that his daughter's artistic eye had identified connections that his financial experts had missed during their initial analysis of Carter's activities. "He's been testing the system," Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of professional fascination as he began to understand the scope and sophistication of Carter's long-term strategy for undermining Skyward Airlines' reputation and his own leadership, creating incidents designed to demonstrate that the company's commitment to passenger dignity was just public relations rhetoric that couldn't survive contact with real-world operational pressures. The aircraft's communication system chimed with an incoming encrypted message from Skyward Airlines' London headquarters, and Vincent's expression as he read the update suggested that the investigation into Carter's activities was revealing evidence that would transform this from a case of corporate embezzlement into something approaching industrial espionage with international implications. Carter's been in communication with executives from 3 different competing airlines. Vincent announced, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was calculating responses that would extend far beyond simply firing a treacherous employee, and the messages show that he was providing them with detailed information about Skyward's operational procedures, passenger complaint protocols, and crisis management strategies. Zara looked up from her laptop with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand that her humiliation at JFK had been just one small part of a much larger campaign designed to destroy her father's company and everything he had spent his career building. "The merger vote next week," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was putting together pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture more disturbing than she had initially imagined. "Carter wasn't just planning to remove you as CEO. He was planning to sell Skyward Airlines' operational secrets to competitors and then position himself as the leader who could rebuild the company's reputation after your supposedly incompetent leadership had destroyed it." Vincent nodded grimly, his expression suggesting that Carter Fleming's betrayal was personal as well as professional, involving the violation of friendships and trust relationships that had been built over years of shared challenges and mutual support in the competitive world of international aviation. "Carter has been my chief financial officer for 8 years, Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that went beyond simple anger at discovering criminal activity within his executive team, and I trusted him with access to every aspect of Skyward's operations, from passenger safety protocols to competitive strategy development. The damage he could have done if this conspiracy had succeeded extends far beyond financial theft to potentially compromising the safety and security of millions of passengers." The aircraft began its descent toward London as the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the cabin in golden light that seemed inappropriate for the dark revelations that were transforming Vincent's understanding of the threats facing his company and his family. Through the windows, they could see the lights of London beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, but what awaited them in the corporate headquarters of Skyward Airlines was a confrontation that would determine whether Vincent's empire would survive the betrayal of someone he had considered a trusted friend and essential partner. When we arrive at headquarters, Vincent said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was preparing for a battle that would require every resource and advantage he could bring to bear, Carter will probably be expecting to present his evidence of your supposed criminal behavior at the board meeting, not realizing that we have documented his entire conspiracy and traced his communications with competitors and corrupted airport personnel. Zara closed her laptop and looked out at the approaching lights of London, her expression suggesting that she was mentally preparing herself for a confrontation that would require her to face the man who had orchestrated her public humiliation as part of a larger strategy to destroy her father's life work. "I want to be there when you confront him," she said, her voice carrying a note of determination that reminded Vincent of her mother's courage in the face of challenges that would have intimidated people with less character and conviction. "Because I want him to see that his plan didn't just fail, but that it created exactly the kind of father-daughter partnership that will make Skyward Airlines stronger and more committed to passenger dignity than it was before he tried to destroy us." Vincent reached across the conference table to squeeze his daughter's hand, his expression carrying the kind of pride that suggested he was seeing in her not just artistic talent and intellectual capability, but the leadership qualities that would eventually make her a worthy successor to the empire he had built through decades of hard work and principled decision-making. But as their aircraft approached London, and the confrontation that would determine the future of Skyward Airlines, both father and daughter understood that Carter Fleming's conspiracy represented more than just personal betrayal or corporate crime. It was evidence of systemic problems within the aviation industry that would require fundamental changes to prevent similar attacks on passenger dignity and corporate integrity in the future. The executive boardroom on the 40th floor of Skyward Airlines' London headquarters had been designed to intimidate visitors and inspire confidence in shareholders with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the Thames and a conference table made from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that had cost more than most people's homes. Under normal circumstances, the room embodied the kind of corporate power and refined luxury that justified investor confidence in Skyward's management and strategic vision. But as Vincent and Zara approached the mahogany doors that led to what would undoubtedly be the most consequential board meeting in the company's history, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom where verdicts would be rendered and sentences imposed. Carter Fleming sat at the head of the table in Vincent's customary chair, his silver hair perfectly styled and his $1,000 suit pressed to military precision, projecting the kind of confident authority that suggested he believed the evening's events at JFK had provided him with exactly the ammunition he needed to complete his long-planned coup against Vincent's leadership. Around the table sat the 12 men and women who comprised Skyward Airlines' board of directors, their expressions suggesting a mixture of curiosity, concern, and calculation, as they prepared to hear Carter's presentation of evidence that would supposedly demonstrate Vincent's unfitness to continue leading the company. Dr. Sarah Williams, the former Secretary of Transportation who chaired Skyward's audit committee, was reviewing documents that Carter had obviously prepared for the meeting, while James Morrison, whose investment fund controlled 15% of the company's shares, was checking his phone with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was already calculating the financial implications of whatever leadership change Carter was about to propose. The other board members were engaged in quiet conversations that ceased immediately when Vincent and Zara entered the room with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested they had been listening outside the door and waiting for exactly the right moment to make their entrance. Vincent, Carter said, rising from the chairman's seat with a smile that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and condescending. "We weren't expecting you back from New York so quickly." I assume you've come to discuss the unfortunate incident involving your daughter at JFK Airport, which I'm afraid raises some serious questions about your judgment in family matters and your ability to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal and professional responsibilities. The words were delivered with the kind of practiced sincerity that career executives developed for delivering bad news to people they were pretending to care about. But Vincent's expression suggested that Carter's performance was wasted on someone who had spent the flight from New York preparing for exactly this confrontation and gathering evidence that would transform Carter's planned ambush into his own professional execution. Carter Vincent replied, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that suggested he was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone underestimated his resources and determination. I'm here to discuss your conspiracy to embezzle funds from Skyward Airlines, provide proprietary information to competing carriers, and coordinate attacks on passengers designed to damage our reputation and justify your takeover of the company. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they realized that what they had expected to be Carter's presentation of evidence against Vincent had somehow been transformed into Vincent's presentation of evidence against Carter. That's a very serious allegation, Dr. Williams said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had spent years in government service learning to navigate political minefields and corporate scandals. And I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims, because accusations of this magnitude could destroy careers and reputations regardless of their ultimate truth or falsehood. Vincent walked slowly around the conference table, his movement creating a sense of theatrical tension that made everyone present understand that they were about to witness something unprecedented in their experience of corporate governance and executive accountability. He stopped behind Carter's chair close enough that his presence would be physically intimidating, but not so close as to appear threatening in a way that might distract from the intellectual demolition he was about to perform. I have comprehensive evidence, Vincent said, pulling out his tablet and connecting it to the room's projection system with the kind of fluid efficiency that suggested he had planned every detail of this presentation during the flight from New York, including communication records, financial transaction logs, witness testimony, and federal investigators who are currently executing search warrants at Carter's home and office while we speak. The room's large display screen flickered to life, showing email headers and message previews that made several board members lean forward with the kind of intense attention that people reserved for documents that could determine their own legal and financial futures. Carter's confident expression began to waver as he recognized his own words appearing on the screen in contexts that revealed planning and coordination that had obviously been intended to remain secret. These communications, Vincent continued, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury that would soon be asked to render a verdict on guilt and innocence, show 18 months of coordination between Carter Fleming and executives from 3 competing airlines, involving the sale of proprietary operational information, passenger complaint data, and strategic planning documents that Carter was providing in exchange for guaranteed employment offers and equity positions. James Morrison made a choking sound that suggested he was beginning to understand that his investment fund's position in Skyward Airlines might be compromised by the criminal activities of executives he had supported and trusted with fiduciary responsibilities that apparently extended to betraying shareholders for personal gain. But the really interesting evidence, Vincent said, scrolling to additional screens that showed financial records and travel documentation, involves Carter's coordination with airport personnel across multiple international terminals, training them to create public incidents involving high-profile passengers that could be recorded and shared on social media platforms to damage Skyward's reputation. Zara stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she was prepared to play whatever role her father needed her to play in this corporate theater, and her presence seemed to remind everyone in the room that the evening's conspiracy had involved not just financial crimes and competitive espionage, but also personal attacks on Vincent's family that had crossed lines that even hardened corporate warriors generally avoided. The attack on my daughter at JFK. Vincent continued, his voice hardening as he reached the personal core of Carter's conspiracy, was specifically designed to create viral video content showing her being humiliated and arrested, which Carter planned to use as evidence that my judgment in family matters had compromised my ability to lead this company effectively. Carter finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak as he realized that his carefully constructed plan had somehow been turned against him in ways he had never anticipated. "Vincent," he said, "you're misinterpreting isolated incidents and normal business communications to create a conspiracy theory that deflects from the real issues of corporate governance and leadership accountability that this board needs to address." Vincent looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he was evaluating a particularly pathetic attempt at deception by someone who had fundamentally underestimated the intellectual and technological resources that would be brought to bear in response to his betrayal. "Carter," Vincent said, "we have recorded phone conversations between you and Melissa Hartwell at JFK Airport, discussing the specific procedures she should follow to ensure that Zara's humiliation would be recorded and shared widely enough to damage my reputation. We have financial records showing payments from shell companies you control to airport personnel at 6 different terminals, and we have testimony from federal investigators who are currently reviewing evidence that your conspiracy may constitute violations of aviation security laws that carry penalties including life imprisonment." The words "life imprisonment" struck the assembled board members like a physical blow as they realized that their colleagues' apparent attempt to gain control of Skyward Airlines had potentially involved criminal activities with consequences that extended far beyond simply losing a corporate power struggle. But Vincent was not finished with his demolition of Carter Fleming's career and reputation, and what he revealed next would ensure that this boardroom confrontation became a permanent reminder of the consequences that awaited executives who believed they could betray the trust of shareholders, employees, and passengers in pursuit of personal advancement and competitive advantage. The methodical destruction of Carter Fleming's elaborate conspiracy began when Vincent activated the room's advanced presentation system, transforming the boardroom's wall-mounted displays into a comprehensive evidence gallery that would leave no doubt about the scope and criminality of the plot that had targeted both Skyward Airlines and the Chen family. The technology was the same system that Vincent used for presenting quarterly results and strategic initiatives to shareholders. But tonight it would serve as a digital courtroom, where financial records and communication logs would provide testimony more damning than any witness could deliver. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made even experienced board members understand that they were about to witness something unprecedented in their experience of corporate governance. "What you're about to see represents 18 months of systematic betrayal by someone we trusted with access to every aspect of Skyward Airlines' operational and strategic information." The first display showed a timeline that stretched across multiple screens with color-coded entries marking Carter's communications with competing airlines, his meetings with corrupted airport personnel, and his financial transactions through shell companies that had been designed to conceal the source and purpose of payments that were clearly intended to facilitate industrial espionage and passenger harassment. Dr. Sarah Williams adjusted her glasses as she leaned forward to examine email headers and message previews that made it clear Carter had been providing detailed information about Skyward's crisis management procedures to executives at competing carriers, who could use that information to anticipate and exploit weaknesses in the company's response to operational challenges and public relations crises. These communications, Vincent continued, pointing to specific entries on the timeline with laser precision, show Carter providing Global Atlantic Airways with detailed analysis of Skyward's passenger complaint resolution procedures, including information about how our customer service protocols could be exploited to create public incidents that would damage our reputation. James Morrison was frantically taking notes on his tablet, clearly calculating the legal and financial implications of having invested his fund's resources in a company whose chief financial officer had been actively working to undermine its competitive position and market value through criminal conspiracy and corporate sabotage. But email communications are just the beginning, Vincent said, scrolling to additional screens that displayed financial records with the kind of forensic detail that suggested teams of accountants and investigators had been working around the clock to trace every dollar that had flowed through Carter's elaborate network of front companies and offshore accounts. The financial evidence is even more comprehensive, Zara added, stepping forward with her laptop connected to the presentation system and displaying charts that showed patterns in Carter's expenses and transactions that her artistic training had helped her identify, because Carter's payments to airport personnel weren't just random bribes, but part of a coordinated strategy to create incidents at specific terminals during specific time periods when high-profile passengers would be traveling. The board members were now studying the financial displays with the kind of intense attention that people reserved for documents that could determine their own legal liability, and several of them were clearly beginning to understand that Carter's criminal activities might have created exposure for the company and its directors that extended far beyond simply firing a corrupt executive. Shell Company Analysis. Vincent announced as new screens filled with corporate registration documents and banking records that revealed the scope of Carter's efforts to conceal his activities from regulatory oversight and internal audit procedures shows that Carter established a network of at least 12 different front companies across 4 countries, all designed to facilitate payments to airport personnel and provide plausible deniability for activities that were clearly criminal in nature. Carter was now visibly sweating despite the boardroom's aggressive air conditioning, his confident demeanor having completely evaporated as he watched 18 months of careful planning and meticulous deception being systematically exposed by technology and investigative resources that he had apparently never considered when designing his conspiracy against Vincent's leadership. The most damaging evidence, Vincent continued, his voice taking on a note of personal betrayal that suggested Carter's treachery had violated not just professional trust, but also personal friendship that had been built over years of shared challenges and mutual support, involves Carter's coordination with Melissa Hartwell and other airport personnel to create specific incidents designed to generate viral video content that could be used to demonstrate my supposed unfitness for corporate leadership. The screen displayed text messages and recorded phone conversations that made it clear Carter had provided Melissa with detailed information about Zara's travel plans, including her flight number, arrival time, and physical description, along with specific instructions about how to ensure that any confrontation would be dramatic enough to attract recording devices and social media attention. These communications, Zara said, her voice carrying a note of controlled anger, as she highlighted specific messages that revealed the personal nature of Carter's attack on her family, show Carter instructing airport personnel to make it ugly and ensure that we need footage of my humiliation, because he believed that viral video of the CEO's daughter being arrested for alleged fraud would provide the ammunition he needed to convince this board that my father's judgment had been compromised by personal bias. Doctor. Williams was now pale with the realization that she had been prepared to participate in a board meeting where evidence of Vincent's alleged poor judgment would have been presented by someone who had actually orchestrated the incidents being used as evidence against him, creating a level of corporate manipulation and deception that could have resulted in catastrophic legal and financial consequences for everyone involved. The coordination extends beyond simple passenger harassment, Vincent announced as new displays revealed communication logs that showed Carter had been providing competing airlines with real-time information about Skyward's operational procedures, passenger safety protocols, and crisis management strategies that could be used to gain competitive advantages and exploit weaknesses in the company's systems and procedures. Industrial espionage charges. James Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible, as he realized that his investment fund's position in Skyward Airlines might be compromised by criminal activities that could result in federal prosecution of executives and potentially massive civil liability for shareholders who had unknowingly benefited from stolen competitive intelligence. But Vincent was not finished with his presentation of evidence against Carter Fleming. And what he revealed next would ensure that this boardroom confrontation resulted not just in the destruction of one corrupt executive's career, but in fundamental changes to corporate governance and accountability that would serve as permanent protection against similar conspiracies in the future. The financial analysis also reveals Vincent continued scrolling to screens that displayed offshore banking records and currency transaction reports that suggested Carter's conspiracy had involved money laundering and tax evasion, in addition to industrial espionage and passenger harassment that Carter has been systematically stealing from Skyward Airline's operational funds to finance his conspiracy, with total embezzlement exceeding $40 million over the past 18 months. The figure struck the board members like a physical blow as they realized that Carter's betrayal had involved not just strategic treachery, but also massive financial theft that would require comprehensive investigation by federal authorities and potentially criminal prosecution in multiple jurisdictions where his shell companies had been operating. Carter Fleming's career was ending in exactly the kind of public humiliation and criminal exposure that he had planned to inflict on Vincent Chen, but the consequences of his conspiracy would extend far beyond his personal destruction to encompass fundamental changes in how airlines approached passenger dignity, corporate security, and executive accountability. The moment when Carter Fleming's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed came not with dramatic shouting or desperate denials, but with a sound that was somehow more unsettling than any outburst could have been. The quiet, bitter laughter of someone who had just realized that their elaborate strategy had not only failed catastrophically, but had actually strengthened the very target they had been trying to destroy. He leaned back in Vincent's chairman's seat with the kind of resigned defiance that suggested he understood his career was over but was determined to inflict as much damage as possible during his professional death throes. "Congratulations," Vincent Carter said, his voice carrying a note of acidic admiration that made everyone in the boardroom understand that they were about to witness the kind of corporate confrontation that would be remembered and analyzed by business schools for decades to come. "You've managed to turn my carefully planned evidence of your emotional instability and poor judgment into a dramatic presentation of your investigative capabilities and protective instincts. It's exactly the kind of manipulative performance that proves my point about your unfitness for corporate leadership." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke, and several board members shifted uncomfortably as they realized that Carter was attempting to reframe his own criminal conspiracy as evidence that Vincent possessed exactly the kind of vindictive and authoritarian tendencies that made him unsuitable for leading a public company with fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders and regulatory obligations to governments across multiple jurisdictions. "You see," Carter continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining complex concepts to students who were too naive to understand the real dynamics of corporate power and competitive strategy. Vincent's response to tonight's events proves that he is fundamentally incapable of separating personal emotions from business decisions. The fact that he has shut down global airline operations and mobilized federal investigators to pursue criminal charges against people who simply challenged his daughter's sense of entitlement demonstrates exactly the kind of emotional instability that shareholders should fear in corporate leadership. Dr. Sarah Williams was taking careful notes, clearly trying to evaluate the merits of Carter's argument while simultaneously processing the evidence that had just been presented regarding his criminal activities and treacherous betrayal of his fiduciary duties to the company and its stakeholders. "Carter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of measured skepticism that came from years of navigating political and corporate environments where truth and deception were often deliberately intertwined. "Your argument about Vincent's emotional instability might be more persuasive if it weren't being presented by someone who has just been exposed as having orchestrated the very incidents you're citing as evidence of his poor judgment." Carter's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that he had hoped the board would focus on Vincent's response to the conspiracy rather than the conspiracy itself, but his voice remained steady as he pressed forward with what was clearly a prepared argument designed to exploit whatever doubts might exist about Vincent's leadership style and decision-making processes. The conspiracy allegations are exactly what I'm talking about," Carter said, his tone becoming more confident as he warmed to his theme, because they demonstrate Vincent's tendency to construct elaborate explanations for simple situations that reflect poorly on his judgment. The fact that his daughter was treated inappropriately at an airport is regrettable, but it hardly justifies shutting down airline operations worldwide and mobilizing federal resources for what amounts to a personal vendetta against people who didn't recognize her privileged status. Vincent watched Carter's performance with the kind of detached fascination that a scientist might feel while observing a particularly interesting specimen, clearly appreciating the psychological complexity of someone who was attempting to use his own criminal conspiracy as evidence of his target's unfitness for leadership. "That's a fascinating perspective," Carter Vincent said, his voice carrying a note of clinical interest that suggested he was genuinely curious about the mental processes that had led to such elaborate self-deception and rationalization. "But it suffers from one significant flaw. The evidence we've presented doesn't just show that you orchestrated attacks on my daughter, but that you've been systematically betraying Skyward Airlines for 18 months, stealing millions of dollars, and providing proprietary information to competitors." Carter's confident expression flickered slightly, but he pressed forward with what was clearly his best remaining strategy for salvaging something from the wreckage of his conspiracy. "Those allegations," he said, "are exactly the kind of paranoid overreaction that proves my point about Vincent's emotional instability. The idea that routine business communications and standard operational procedures constitute evidence of some vast conspiracy demonstrates the kind of delusional thinking that makes him unsuitable for corporate leadership." James Morrison looked up from his notes with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that Carter's argument was not just legally dubious, but also logically incoherent. "Carter," he said, "we've all seen the financial records showing payments to airport personnel through shell companies you controlled. Are you seriously arguing that those transactions represent routine business communications and standard operational procedures?" Carter paused for a moment, clearly calculating whether he should continue trying to maintain his innocence or shift to a different strategy that might provide him with more defensible ground from which to attack Vincent's leadership and decision-making capabilities. "The financial irregularities," he said finally, "are the result of operational security procedures that were designed to protect Skyward Airlines from exactly the kind of corporate espionage and competitive intelligence gathering that Vincent's emotional response to tonight's events has now exposed to our competitors and regulatory authorities." The explanation was so audaciously dishonest that several board members actually laughed out loud, clearly appreciating the psychological complexity of someone who was attempting to characterize massive embezzlement and criminal conspiracy as protective security measures designed to benefit the company he had been systematically betraying. But Carter was not finished with his desperate attempt to reframe his criminal activities as evidence of Vincent's unfitness for leadership, and what he said next would ensure that his professional destruction would be complete and irreversible. "The real question this board needs to answer," Carter continued, his voice rising as he made what was clearly his final attempt to salvage something from his failed conspiracy, "is whether Vincent Chen possesses the emotional stability and business judgment necessary to lead a public company, or whether his vindictive response to personal slights and family embarrassments demonstrates exactly the kind of authoritarian tendencies that will eventually destroy shareholder value and regulatory relationships." Vincent looked around the boardroom at the faces of directors who had worked with him for years, building Skyward Airlines into one of the world's most successful and respected carriers, and his expression suggested that he was confident about how they would respond to Carter's desperate attempt to portray criminal conspiracy as evidence of his target's emotional instability. But before Vincent could respond to Carter's final argument, the boardroom door opened to admit federal agents whose presence would ensure that this corporate confrontation would have consequences extending far beyond the careers and reputations of the executives involved. The arrival of federal agents at Skyward Airlines' corporate headquarters transformed the boardroom from a site of corporate governance into an active crime scene, as Special Agent Rebecca Martinez and her team entered with the kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested they had spent the flight from New York reviewing evidence and preparing arrest warrants that would ensure Carter Fleming's conspiracy would have consequences extending far beyond simply losing his job and his reputation. Carter Fleming. Agent Martinez, said her voice carrying the kind of formal authority that made everyone in the room understand that they were witnessing the intersection of corporate crime and federal justice. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, violations of federal aviation security laws, and industrial espionage. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda warning filled the elegant boardroom with the harsh realities of criminal prosecution, and Carter's confident demeanor finally collapsed completely as he realized that his elaborate conspiracy had transformed him from a corporate executive into a federal defendant whose legal problems would consume whatever remained of his wealth, his freedom, and his reputation. Dr. Sarah Williams was frantically reviewing her notes, clearly trying to calculate the legal and financial implications for Skyward Airlines and its board members of having harbored a criminal conspiracy within the company's executive leadership, while James Morrison was already making phone calls to legal counsel and investment advisors who would help him navigate the regulatory and financial consequences of discovering that his investment fund had been supporting a company whose CFO was apparently a federal criminal. The evidence we collected at JFK Airport, Agent Martinez continued addressing the board members who were now understanding that their emergency meeting had become a briefing on federal criminal charges that would require comprehensive investigation and potentially massive legal and financial consequences for everyone involved, combined with the financial records and communication logs that Mr. Chen provided supports charges that could result in life imprisonment for activities that compromised aviation security and endangered passenger safety. Carter was handcuffed with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested federal agents had extensive experience with arresting corporate executives who had believed their wealth and position would protect them from the consequences of criminal activities, and his earlier confidence had been replaced by the pale, sweaty appearance of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of the legal and financial disaster that was about to consume his life. "This is insane," Carter said, his voice cracking as he made one final attempt to maintain some semblance of dignity while being led toward the boardroom door in handcuffs. "Vincent has manipulated you into treating standard business practices as federal crimes because he can't accept that his emotional instability and poor judgment have made him unsuitable for corporate leadership." Agent Martinez looked at him with the kind of expression that federal investigators reserved for defendants who were attempting to use their arrest as an opportunity to continue committing the crimes they were being charged with. "Mr. Fleming," she said, continuing to make false statements about the victims of your conspiracy while you're being arrested for that conspiracy, constitutes additional federal charges that will be included in your indictment. Vincent watched Carter's removal from the boardroom with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing justice served against someone who had betrayed not just professional trust, but also personal friendship in pursuit of corporate power and competitive advantage. But his expression suggested that Carter's arrest was just the beginning of changes that would extend far beyond punishing one corrupt executive. The board Vincent announced, his voice carrying clearly through the boardroom as federal agents completed their evidence collection and arrest procedures will now vote on emergency measures designed to prevent future conspiracies against Skyward Airlines operations, passenger safety, and corporate integrity. "Dr." Williams looked up from her notes with an expression that suggested she was prepared to support whatever measures would protect the company and its shareholders from similar criminal activities in the future, while also ensuring that board members who had unknowingly participated in meetings where evidence of criminal conspiracy was being presented would not face personal legal liability for Carter's crimes. The first measure, Vincent continued, involves comprehensive restructuring of executive oversight and accountability procedures, including mandatory federal background checks for all senior executives, and board members, real-time monitoring of all corporate communications and financial transactions, and automatic reporting of suspected criminal activity to federal authorities. James Morrison nodded with the kind of enthusiastic agreement that suggested he was eager to demonstrate his support for corporate transparency and criminal accountability, especially given that his investment fund's position in Skyward Airlines might be compromised by any suggestion that the company's board had been negligent in its oversight of executive criminal activities. The second measure Vincent announced involves the immediate implementation of passenger dignity protocols at all airports where Skyward Airlines operates, including mandatory bias training for all personnel, real-time monitoring of passenger interactions, and automatic federal investigation of any discrimination complaints involving airline operations. The measures represented exactly the kind of comprehensive response that Vincent had been planning during the flight from New York, transforming his daughter's humiliation and Carter's criminal conspiracy into institutional changes that would serve as permanent protection against similar attacks on passenger dignity and corporate integrity. But even as the board members voted unanimously to approve Vincent's emergency measures, his expression suggested that Carter Fleming's arrest was just the beginning of a broader transformation that would extend far beyond Skyward Airlines to encompass fundamental changes in how the aviation industry approached passenger rights, executive accountability, and corporate responsibility for the treatment of people who trusted airlines with their safety, their money, and their dignity. Zara stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested she was prepared to play a leading role in implementing the changes that would ensure Carter's conspiracy would result in lasting improvements, rather than simply the punishment of one corrupt executive. The passenger dignity protocols, she announced, will include comprehensive redesign of airport facilities to eliminate visual hierarchies that promote discrimination, mandatory training programs that emphasize service over exclusion, and real-time technology that detects and prevents prejudicial treatment before it can escalate into the kind of humiliation I experienced at JFK. But as federal agents completed their arrest procedures and the board voted to transform Skyward Airlines' approach to passenger dignity and corporate accountability, Vincent's expression suggested that the real work of rebuilding trust and ensuring that no other family would experience the kind of attack that had targeted the Chen family was just beginning. 3 months after the arrest of Carter Fleming and the federal investigation that had exposed the conspiracy targeting Skyward Airlines and the Chen family, Zara stood in the renovated Priority Services area at JFK Terminal 4. Watching passengers interact with airline personnel in ways that would have been impossible under the old regime of velvet ropes and mahogany fortresses. The space had been completely transformed according to her artistic vision and her understanding of how physical environments could either promote human dignity or undermine it through subtle messages about worth and belonging. The harsh fluorescent lighting that had once made everyone look sickly and desperate had been replaced with warm LED panels that mimicked natural sunlight and actually improved people's mood and energy levels as they moved through the check-in process. The intimidating mahogany counter that had served as Melissa Hartwell's fortress against the unworthy had been replaced with curved, accessible stations where airline personnel stood at the same level as passengers, creating the kind of eye-to-eye interaction that suggested mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. But the most significant change was the complete elimination of the velvet rope barriers that had physically separated first-class passengers from economy travelers, creating visible divisions that had encouraged both discrimination by airline personnel and resentment among passengers who understood that their economic circumstances determined how they would be treated as human beings. Instead, Zara had designed a flowing space with natural wayfinding elements that guided people to appropriate service areas without creating the impression that some passengers were more valuable than others. The psychology of airport design, Zara explained to a group of visiting airline executives who had come to study Skyward's revolutionary approach to passenger services, has traditionally been based on the assumption that luxury is defined by exclusion, that first-class passengers only feel special if economy passengers are made to feel inferior. But our research shows that dignity and respect are not zero-sum commodities, and that treating all passengers with basic human courtesy actually enhances the experience for everyone. The visiting executives were taking careful notes as they observed interactions between Skyward personnel and passengers of all economic backgrounds, clearly impressed by the efficiency and satisfaction levels that had resulted from Zara's comprehensive redesign of both physical spaces and service protocols. What they were seeing challenged fundamental assumptions about class hierarchies and customer service that had governed the airline industry for decades. Vincent watched his daughter's presentation with the kind of pride that came from seeing someone transform personal trauma into professional expertise that would benefit millions of people who would never know her name, but would experience the dignity and respect that her vision had built into every aspect of the travel experience. In the 3 months since Carter's arrest, Zara had proven herself to be not just a talented artist, but also an innovative business leader whose understanding of human psychology and social dynamics had enabled her to design solutions to problems that traditional airline executives had never even recognized. The staff retraining program, Zara continued gesturing toward the service stations where airline personnel were helping passengers with the kind of genuine warmth that had replaced the fake smiles and condescending politeness of the old regime. Focuses on empathy and problem-solving rather than enforcement and exclusion. Instead of training employees to identify and reject passengers who don't belong in premium areas, we train them to identify passengers who need assistance and provide solutions that enhance their travel experience. The transformation was visible in every interaction, as airline personnel approached their work with the understanding that their primary responsibility was to help people rather than to protect company resources from unworthy demands for service and attention. Sarah Martinez, who had replaced Melissa Hartwell as the senior customer service representative, embodied the new approach with her genuine interest in each passenger's needs and her creative problem-solving when flights were delayed or travel plans needed to be modified. Ms. Chen said Maria Rodriguez, the head of customer experience for Global Atlantic Airways, one of the competing airlines that had purchased stolen information from Carter Fleming's conspiracy, the passenger satisfaction scores that Skyward has achieved since implementing your dignity protocols are unprecedented in the industry. How do you maintain service efficiency while providing such individualized attention to passenger needs? Zara smiled with the kind of confidence that came from having data and results to support her theoretical framework for transforming airline customer service. The efficiency actually improves when you eliminate the time and energy that staff previously spent on determining who deserved good service and who didn't, she explained. When everyone receives the same baseline level of respect and attention, employees can focus their expertise on solving problems rather than enforcing arbitrary hierarchies. The visiting executives were clearly struggling to reconcile Zara's approach with their own company's traditional methods of maintaining premium service levels through exclusivity and differential treatment. But the evidence was overwhelming that Skyward's new protocols had resulted in higher customer satisfaction, improved employee morale, and increased profitability across all service categories. Dr. James Thompson, who served on the board of directors for 2 major airlines and had been skeptical of Skyward's transformation until he saw the quarterly results, raised his hand with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he was genuinely interested in understanding how Zara's vision could be adapted to other companies and operational environments. Ms. Chen, he said, the financial data shows that Skyward's passenger dignity protocols have actually increased revenue from first-class services while reducing customer complaints and employee turnover. How do you explain those results to executives who have traditionally believed that luxury services require exclusivity and differential treatment to maintain their premium pricing? Zara nodded clearly. Having anticipated exactly that question from executives whose entire understanding of customer service was based on creating artificial scarcity and social hierarchies that justified premium pricing through exclusion rather than excellence. The traditional model assumes that first-class passengers pay premium prices for the privilege of being treated better than other passengers," she explained. "But our research shows that what they actually value is exceptional service, not the knowledge that other people are receiving poor service." When you eliminate discrimination against economy passengers, first-class passengers still receive faster check-in, priority boarding, and premium amenities, but they also travel on an airline where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, which enhances their own sense of satisfaction with their travel choice. Vincent stepped forward to add his perspective as someone who had spent decades building an airline around the principle that profitability and human dignity were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. The old model of customer service was based on scarcity and hierarchy, he said, but the new model is based on abundance and excellence. When you train your staff to provide exceptional service to everyone, you create a culture of excellence that benefits all passengers and actually justifies premium pricing through superior quality rather than artificial exclusion. But even as Vincent and Zara demonstrated the success of their transformation at JFK Terminal 4, their expressions suggested that they understood this was just the beginning of changes that would need to extend throughout the aviation industry to ensure that no other family would experience the kind of attack that had targeted them, and that passengers of all backgrounds could travel with the dignity and respect that should be fundamental human rights rather than privileges to be purchased. 6 months after the incident that had transformed her from art student to director of customer experience, Zara returned to JFK Terminal 4 in the same paint-stained hoodie and scuffed sneakers that had once made Melissa Hartwell assume she was a fraud attempting to scam her way into first-class service. But this time, Zara was conducting a deliberate test of the systems and protocols she had designed to ensure that passenger dignity would never again be determined by appearance, economic status, or the prejudices of airline personnel. She had booked herself in economy class under an assumed name, carrying only a basic boarding pass and a worn backpack that would have triggered every discriminatory assumption that had governed the old regime of airport customer service. The test was designed to determine whether Skyward's transformation had created genuine cultural change or simply new procedures that could be abandoned when management attention was focused elsewhere. "Good morning," said Sarah Martinez, the customer service representative who had replaced Melissa and who was approaching Zara's position in the check-in line with the kind of genuine warmth that had become the hallmark of Skyward's new approach to passenger interactions. "I noticed you've been waiting for a while, and I wanted to check if there's anything I can help you with to make your travel experience more comfortable today." The offer was exactly what Zara had hoped to hear, representing the proactive approach to passenger assistance that had replaced the reactive enforcement of exclusionary policies that had characterized the old system. Instead of waiting for passengers to prove their worthiness for attention and service, Skyward personnel were now trained to identify opportunities to enhance the travel experience for everyone who entered their facility. "I'm flying economy to London this afternoon," Zara replied, using the slightly nervous tone that she remembered from her days as a genuine art student struggling to navigate airport procedures that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who wasn't already familiar with the rituals of luxury travel. "My flight got delayed yesterday, and I'm not sure if my connecting flight arrangement is still valid." Sarah nodded with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was genuinely interested in solving Zara's problem rather than determining whether Zara deserved to have her problem solved. "Let me check your reservation and see what options we have," she said, leading Zara to one of the curved service stations that had replaced the intimidating mahogany fortress where Melissa had once presided over the territorial borders of first-class exclusivity. The interaction proceeded exactly as Zara had designed it to work, with Sarah accessing the reservation system and immediately identifying several options for ensuring that Zara's travel plans would be successfully completed despite the delay that had complicated her itinerary. The process was efficient-friendly and focused entirely on problem-solving rather than on evaluating Zara's worthiness for assistance based on her appearance or economic status. "I can confirm your London connection and upgrade your seat assignment to provide extra legroom at no additional charge," Sarah explained, since the delay was our responsibility, and we want to ensure your travel experience meets your expectations. I can also provide you with meal vouchers for the airport restaurants and access to our passenger lounge area if you need a quiet space to rest or work during your extended layover. The offer represented exactly the kind of proactive customer service that Zara had envisioned when she designed the new protocols, providing genuine value and attention to passengers regardless of their ticket category or economic circumstances. The fact that Sarah was offering premium amenities to an economy passenger based on service recovery principles rather than revenue optimization demonstrated that the cultural transformation had taken root in ways that went beyond simple policy compliance. "That's incredibly helpful," Zara said, genuinely impressed by the extent to which her theoretical framework had been successfully implemented by staff members who understood that their primary responsibility was to enhance passenger satisfaction rather than to protect company resources from unworthy demands. I was worried about missing my connection and having to pay for rebooking fees. Sarah smiled with the kind of satisfaction that came from being able to solve passenger problems rather than create them. "That's exactly why we're here," she said. "Air travel can be stressful enough without having to worry about additional complications that are beyond your control. Our goal is to make sure that every passenger feels supported and valued regardless of what challenges they might encounter during their journey." As Zara completed her check-in process and moved toward the security checkpoint, she reflected on the profound changes that had transformed Terminal 4 from a site of humiliation and discrimination into a space where human dignity was protected and enhanced through thoughtful design and compassionate service. The physical transformation was impressive, but the cultural shift represented something even more significant, proof that institutional change was possible when leadership committed to principles of equity and respect rather than hierarchy and exclusion. Vincent was waiting for her at the departure gate, having monitored her test of the new system through discreet observation and communication with airport management. His expression suggested that he was satisfied with the results, but also understood that maintaining cultural change would require ongoing attention and reinforcement to prevent regression to the old patterns of discrimination and exclusion. "How did it go?" he asked, though his tone suggested that he had already observed enough to know that the test had confirmed the success of their transformation efforts. "Better than I hoped," Zara replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that had replaced the harsh plastic seating of the old terminal design. "Sarah offered me the kind of assistance and accommodation that would have been unthinkable under the old system, and she did it with genuine enthusiasm rather than reluctant compliance with policy requirements." Vincent nodded with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical principles successfully implemented in real-world operational environments where they would affect millions of passengers over the course of many years. "The test results are important," he said, "but the real measure of our success will be whether these changes survive and spread throughout the industry or whether they remain isolated improvements that competitors ignore while continuing to operate under the old assumptions about hierarchy and exclusion." Zara looked around the bustling terminal, watching passengers of all backgrounds interact with airline personnel who had been trained to provide service based on human dignity rather than economic status, and her expression suggested that she was already thinking about the next phase of transformation that would be needed to ensure that the changes they had implemented would become permanent fixtures of aviation industry culture, rather than temporary reforms that could be abandoned when financial pressures or competitive challenges required cost-cutting measures. But as they prepared to board their flight to London, both father and daughter understood that their work was just beginning, and that transforming the aviation industry's approach to passenger dignity would require sustained effort and continued innovation to ensure that the lessons learned from Carter Fleming's conspiracy would create lasting protection for travelers who deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of their economic circumstances or social status. The consequences of Carter Fleming's conspiracy and subsequent federal conviction had rippled far beyond the boardroom of Skyward Airlines, creating waves of change throughout the aviation industry that transformed how airlines approached passenger relations, executive accountability, and corporate governance in ways that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional regulatory processes or consumer advocacy campaigns. The story of Zara's humiliation and Vincent's response had become a case study in business schools and law enforcement agencies, demonstrating how individual courage and technological resources could expose institutional corruption and create industry-wide transformation. Melissa Hartwell sat in the library of the Federal Correctional Facility where she was serving a 2-year sentence for wire fraud conspiracy and violations of federal aviation regulations, reading news articles about the changes that had swept through the airline industry in the 18 months since her arrest at JFK Terminal 4. The irony was not lost on her that the discrimination and humiliation she had inflicted on Zara Chen had ultimately resulted in protections for millions of passengers who would benefit from reforms that might never have been implemented without the shocking video footage of her cruel treatment of a young woman whose only crime had been asking for basic customer service. The letter she was writing to Zara would never be sent, but the process of composing it had become part of her therapy and rehabilitation as she struggled to understand how her prejudices and petty exercise of power had contributed to a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed multiple careers and transformed an entire industry's approach to passenger dignity and human rights. I understand now, she wrote in careful handwriting that reflected the time she had to think about each word and its implications. What it feels like to be powerless to be judged by people who have never bothered to learn anything about your circumstances or your character, to be treated as if your basic human dignity was a privilege that could be granted or withheld based on someone else's arbitrary decisions about your worth. The understanding had come slowly through conversations with other inmates who had also been convicted of federal crimes, but who came from backgrounds that had given them different perspectives on justice, power, and the responsibility that comes with positions of authority over vulnerable people. Melissa's time in federal prison had educated her about inequality and institutional bias in ways that 15 years of airline customer service had somehow failed to do. Theodore and Margaret Blackwood were experiencing their own education in powerlessness as they navigated the bankruptcy proceedings that would determine how much of their former wealth could be preserved after paying civil damages to Skyward Airlines and legal fees for the federal criminal defense that had ultimately resulted in plea agreements and suspended sentences. The luxury automobile dealerships that had provided the foundation for their social status and financial security had been sold to cover legal costs and civil judgments that reflected their role in Carter Fleming's conspiracy. Theodore now worked in retail sales at an electronics store, experiencing for the first time in his adult life the kind of economic insecurity and workplace vulnerability that most Americans accepted as normal conditions of employment. The humiliation of being supervised by people half his age and earning wages that couldn't support the lifestyle he had taken for granted was teaching him lessons about social hierarchy and human dignity that his previous wealth had insulated him from learning. The worst part, Margaret confided to her sister during one of their weekly phone calls, isn't the money or the house or even having to shop for clothes at discount stores. It's the way people treat you when they think you don't matter, when they assume you're powerless and desperate and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they might throw your way. The irony that Margaret was now experiencing exactly the treatment she had encouraged Melissa to inflict on Zara was painful but educational, providing her with insights into empathy and human dignity that her previous privilege had prevented her from developing. The bankruptcy proceedings had stripped away the external markers of status and success that had shaped her identity, forcing her to discover who she was when she couldn't buy respect or demand deference from people who served her needs. But the most significant ripple effects were visible throughout the aviation industry, where airlines that had initially resisted Skyward's passenger dignity protocols were now implementing similar reforms in response to competitive pressure and regulatory scrutiny that had followed the extensive media coverage of Carter Fleming's conspiracy and federal conviction. Global Atlantic Airways, one of the companies that had purchased stolen information from Carter's conspiracy, was facing federal investigation and massive civil liability for their role in industrial espionage. But they were also implementing comprehensive passenger rights reforms that went beyond anything required by current regulations. CEO Patricia Nordstrom had personally apologized to Zara and Vincent in a public ceremony that acknowledged her company's participation in criminal conspiracy and committed to supporting industry-wide transformation. The Chen incident, as it had become known in aviation industry publications and federal regulatory discussions, had created momentum for congressional legislation that would establish passenger dignity as a federal right, with criminal penalties for airline personnel who discriminated against travelers based on appearance, economic status, or other characteristics unrelated to legitimate safety and security concerns. Senator Elizabeth Warren was sponsoring the Passenger Dignity Act, which would require all airlines operating in United States airspace to implement bias detection systems, provide mandatory training on respectful customer service, and submit to regular federal audits of their passenger treatment protocols. The legislation had bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognized that airline customer service had become a symbol of broader issues about corporate accountability and institutional respect for human dignity. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, who served on the Federal Aviation Administration's Passenger Rights Committee, was using Skyward's transformation as a model for industry-wide reforms that would prevent the kind of discriminatory treatment that had been routine at airports across the country. The Chen case demonstrates that change is possible when leadership commits to principles over profits, she explained in testimony before the Senate Commerce Committee. But it also shows that voluntary reforms are insufficient to protect passengers who lack the resources and connections to defend themselves against institutional bias. The technology that Vincent had used to expose Carter's conspiracy had been adapted and expanded into commercial software that other airlines could use to monitor passenger interactions and detect patterns of discriminatory treatment before they escalated into public incidents or federal investigations. The bias detection systems developed by Skyward's technology team were being licensed to airlines worldwide, creating a new standard for passenger protection that was becoming as essential as safety equipment and security protocols. But perhaps the most important ripple effect was visible in the thousands of airline employees who had participated in training programs based on Zara's research into the psychology of customer service and human dignity. The transformation of airport personnel from enforcers of exclusionary hierarchies into facilitators of positive travel experiences was creating cultural change that extended far beyond aviation into other service industries where similar principles of respect and empathy were being implemented. The letter that Melissa would never send to Zara concluded with words that captured the fundamental lesson of the entire conspiracy and its aftermath. I learned that dignity is not something you fight for or earn through worthiness. It's something you possess as a human being, and systems must be designed to recognize and protect that dignity rather than exploit and undermine it. 1 year to the day after Melissa Hartwell had confiscated her phone and called security to have her arrested for the crime of asking for customer service, Zara Chen stood at the same JFK Terminal 4 check-in counter where her humiliation had been transformed into a catalyst for industry-wide change. She was wearing the same paint-stained hoodie and scuffed sneakers that had once triggered assumptions about her worthiness for respectful treatment. But this time she was there by choice, conducting a final assessment of the transformation that had grown from her personal trauma into institutional reform that would protect millions of future passengers. The physical space bore no resemblance to the intimidating fortress of mahogany and velvet ropes where Melissa had once presided over the arbitrary distribution of dignity and respect based on her personal prejudices and financial incentives to discriminate against passengers who didn't meet her aesthetic standards for first-class worthiness. The curved service stations and warm lighting created an atmosphere of welcome rather than exclusion, and the staff interactions she observed demonstrated genuine commitment to the principles of passenger dignity that had been implemented throughout Skyward's operations. Mrs. Chen said David Park, the new director of terminal operations, who had replaced the management team that had enabled Melissa's discriminatory practices. "Would you like me to arrange priority boarding for your flight this afternoon?" Zara shook her head with a smile that reflected her genuine satisfaction with how thoroughly the culture of the terminal had been transformed. "I'll be flying economy today," she said, "because I want to experience the same treatment that any other passenger would receive, and I want to make sure that our dignity protocols are working for people who don't have connections to airline management." The decision to fly economy was both practical and symbolic, representing Zara's commitment to understanding the passenger experience from the perspective of people who couldn't rely on family connections or personal wealth to ensure respectful treatment when they encountered problems or challenges during their travel. Her year as Director of Customer Experience had taught her that real transformation required constant attention to the experiences of the most vulnerable passengers rather than simply improving service for people who already possessed the resources to demand accountability. Vincent was waiting for her at the departure gate, reading reports on his tablet about the expansion of Skyward's passenger dignity protocols to airlines in 12 countries that had voluntarily adopted the systems and training programs that had emerged from their response to Carter Fleming's conspiracy. His expression reflected both pride in what they had accomplished and awareness that sustaining cultural change would require ongoing commitment and innovation to prevent regression to the old patterns of discrimination and institutional bias. "The quarterly results are exceptional," he told Zara as she settled into the seat beside him with passenger satisfaction scores that exceed anything we achieved under the old system. Employee morale at historic highs and profitability that proves dignity and financial success are not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. Zara nodded, reviewing her own notes about the implementation challenges and successes they had encountered during the year of transformation that had followed Carter's arrest and the exposure of his elaborate conspiracy against their family and their company. The data supported their theoretical framework, but she knew that numbers alone were insufficient to measure the human impact of creating systems that protected passenger dignity rather than exploiting passenger vulnerability. "The real test," she said, "is whether these changes will survive when we're no longer personally involved in overseeing every detail of implementation, and whether other airlines will maintain their commitment to passenger dignity when competitive pressures and economic challenges create incentives to reduce costs by returning to the old patterns of discrimination and exclusion." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement that their flight to London would be delayed by 2 hours due to weather conditions, creating exactly the kind of situation that would test whether Skyward's transformation had created genuine cultural change or simply new procedures that might be abandoned when operational pressures created conflicts between efficiency and passenger care. Zara watched carefully as airline personnel responded to the delay, observing their interactions with frustrated passengers who were facing missed connections, disrupted travel plans, and the stress that always accompanied unexpected changes to carefully planned itineraries. What she saw confirmed that the training programs and cultural changes had taken root in ways that went beyond policy compliance to encompass genuine commitment to passenger dignity and problem solving. Rather than simply announcing the delay and leaving passengers to manage the consequences on their own, Skyward staff were proactively approaching affected travelers to offer rebooking assistance, meal vouchers, lounge access, and other accommodations that demonstrated genuine concern for passenger welfare rather than minimal compliance with regulatory requirements for delay compensation. "Ms. Thompson," She heard Sarah Martinez say to an elderly woman who was worried about missing her granddaughter's wedding in London, "Let me see what options we have for getting you to London on time. I can rebook you on our partner airline's flight that departs in 90 minutes, or I can confirm your seat on tomorrow morning's departure and arrange overnight accommodation at one of our partner hotels near the airport." The interaction represented exactly the kind of proactive problem-solving that Zara had envisioned when she designed the new customer service protocols, with airline personnel taking ownership of passenger problems rather than simply explaining why company policies prevented them from providing meaningful assistance. The cultural transformation had created an environment where employees were empowered and encouraged to find solutions rather than defend regulations and procedures that often served corporate interests at the expense of passenger needs. An hour later, as Zara finally boarded the delayed flight in her economy seat near the middle of the aircraft, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from art student to aviation industry reformer, and on the personal growth that had come from transforming trauma into purpose and using privilege to create protections for people who lacked the resources to defend themselves against institutional bias and corporate indifference. The flight attendant who welcomed her aboard was someone she didn't recognize, which provided her with confidence that the cultural changes had spread throughout Skyward's operations, rather than being limited to high-visibility areas where senior management might be observing interactions and evaluating compliance with new policies and procedures. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said with genuine warmth that reflected none of the artificial politeness or condescending cheerfulness that had characterized airline customer service under the old regime of hierarchical treatment and exclusionary practices. "Is there anything I can help you with to make your flight more comfortable today?" Zara settled into her economy seat with a sense of completion and continuation, understanding that her work had succeeded in creating the kind of institutional change that would outlast individual personalities and corporate leadership transitions. The systems and culture that had emerged from her year of transformation were robust enough to survive the normal pressures and challenges of business operations while remaining flexible enough to adapt and improve based on passenger feedback and operational experience. But as the aircraft taxied toward the runway and prepared for takeoff, Zara's expression suggested that she was already thinking about the next phase of her career and the broader challenges of ensuring that human dignity remained protected and enhanced in a world where technology and corporate power were creating new opportunities for both liberation and oppression. The auditorium at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business was filled to capacity with aviation industry executives, federal regulators, passenger advocacy representatives, and business school students who had come to hear Zara Chen deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Airline Passenger Rights, an annual gathering that had become the premier forum for discussing the intersection of corporate responsibility, customer service excellence, and human dignity in commercial aviation. 18 months after the incident that had transformed her from art student to industry reformer, Zara had become one of the most influential voices in the ongoing transformation of airline passenger services, with her research and practical innovations being studied and implemented by carriers across 6 continents. But as she approached the podium, where she would address an audience whose decisions would affect millions of travelers, her expression reflected both the confidence that came from proven success and the humility that came from understanding how much work remained to be done. 18 months ago, Zara began her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system to reach not just the assembled audience, but also the thousands of people who were live streaming the conference through social media platforms that would ensure her words reached a global audience. "I was humiliated at JFK Airport by airline personnel who decided that my appearance and economic status made me unworthy of basic human respect and customer service." The opening statement created immediate attention and silence, as everyone present understood that they were about to hear first-hand testimony from someone whose personal experience had become a symbol of institutional bias and corporate indifference to passenger dignity throughout the aviation industry. But what I learned from that experience, Zara continued, is that humiliation can become transformation when it's channeled into purpose, and that personal trauma can become institutional change when it's supported by leadership that's committed to principles over profits and human dignity over arbitrary hierarchies. Vincent sat in the front row with the kind of paternal pride that reflected not just his love for his daughter, but also his professional respect for someone who had taken theoretical principles and transformed them into practical systems that were improving the travel experience for millions of passengers worldwide. The changes we've implemented at Skyward Airlines, Zara explained, prove that passenger dignity and corporate profitability are not competing priorities, but mutually reinforcing values that create sustainable competitive advantages for companies that are willing to invest in cultural transformation rather than simply policy compliance. The audience was taking careful notes as Zara presented data about passenger satisfaction, employee morale, and financial performance that challenged fundamental assumptions about customer service that had governed the aviation industry for decades. The evidence was overwhelming that treating all passengers with respect and dignity actually enhanced the experience for premium customers rather than diminishing the exclusivity that had traditionally justified higher prices for first-class services. But individual corporate transformation is insufficient. Zara continued, her voice taking on a note of urgency as she addressed the broader challenges of creating industry-wide change that would protect vulnerable passengers from the kind of institutional bias that had targeted her family. Because passengers don't just fly on one airline, and discrimination at any airport or carrier undermines public confidence in the entire industry's commitment to human dignity and customer service excellence. Dr. Amanda Foster, who served as the Federal Aviation Administration's Director of Passenger Rights and had been instrumental in developing the regulatory framework that had emerged from congressional hearings on Carter Fleming's conspiracy, nodded in agreement from her seat in the second row, clearly understanding that Zara's presentation was building toward policy recommendations that would require federal action to ensure industry-wide implementation. The Passenger Dignity Act that is currently before Congress, Zara announced, represents exactly the kind of federal leadership that is needed to ensure that the changes we've proven possible at Skyward Airlines become standard practice throughout the aviation industry, with criminal penalties for personnel who discriminate against passengers and civil liability for airlines that fail to protect passenger dignity through adequate training and oversight. The legislation had gained momentum following extensive media coverage of the transformations that had resulted from Zara's work. But opposition from airline industry lobbying groups that were concerned about implementation costs and regulatory oversight had slowed progress through the congressional committee process. The opposition to federal passenger dignity requirements, Zara continued, comes from executives who believe that respectful customer service is a cost to be minimized rather than an investment that generates both moral and financial returns, and from airline personnel who have been trained to think of passengers as revenue sources to be exploited rather than human beings to be served. Senator Maria Rodriguez, who was sponsoring the Passenger Dignity Act in the Senate, had traveled from Washington to attend Zara's presentation and was clearly using the conference as an opportunity to build support for legislation that had become a symbol of broader efforts to ensure corporate accountability and consumer protection in industries where individual passengers lacked the resources to defend themselves against institutional bias and discriminatory treatment. Mrs. Chen's research and practical experience, Senator Rodriguez announced when she was invited to respond to Zara's presentation, demonstrate that federal legislation is both necessary and feasible, and that the economic arguments against passenger dignity requirements are based on outdated assumptions about customer service that ignore the competitive advantages that come from treating all customers with respect, regardless of their economic circumstances. The conference continued for 2 more days with presentations about implementation challenges, technology solutions, and international coordination that would be needed to create global standards for passenger dignity and airline customer service. But Zara's keynote address had established the moral and practical framework that would guide those discussions and their policy recommendations. On the final evening of the conference, as Zara and Vincent prepared to return to London, They reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from a traumatic airport confrontation to leadership roles in transforming an entire industry's approach to human dignity and corporate responsibility. Mom would have been proud, Zara said, her voice carrying the emotion that always accompanied references to her mother, whose death from cancer had occurred 2 years before the incident that had changed their lives and revealed the depth of their commitment to principles that transcended personal comfort and financial success. Vincent nodded, his expression reflecting both grief for his wife's absence and gratitude for the daughter whose courage and vision had transformed their shared trauma into institutional change that would benefit millions of people who would never know their names, but would experience the dignity and respect that their work had built into the systems and culture of commercial aviation. She would have understood. Vincent replied that sometimes the most important work we do comes from the worst experiences we survive, and that the measure of our character is not whether we avoid hardship, but whether we transform hardship into something that serves purposes larger than our own comfort and success. As their aircraft lifted off from Washington and climbed into the night sky above the Atlantic, both father and daughter understood that their work was not complete, but had reached a stage where the systems and principles they had created would continue to evolve and improve through the efforts of thousands of other people who shared their commitment to human dignity and corporate responsibility in industries where individual vulnerability required institutional protection and support. The lights of the eastern seaboard sparkled below them like a constellation of human dreams and aspirations, each point of light representing families and communities whose lives would be touched by the changes that had grown from a single moment of courage in the face of institutional bias and corporate indifference to passenger dignity and human rights. 2 years after Melissa Hartwell confiscated a young woman's phone and called security to remove her from the priority boarding area, the aviation industry had been fundamentally transformed by the ripple effects of what became known as the Chen Protocols. Every major airline operating in international markets had implemented comprehensive passenger dignity requirements, not because federal regulations mandated such changes, but because competitive pressure from Skyward Airlines' success had made respectful customer service a business necessity rather than a moral luxury. Melissa herself emerged from federal prison with a completely transformed understanding of power, dignity, and human worth, becoming an advocate for service industry workers who faced pressure to discriminate against customers based on appearance and economic status. Her training programs helped airline personnel recognize and overcome the unconscious biases that had once made discrimination seem like professional responsibility, rather than personal failure to recognize the humanity of every passenger who trusted airlines with their safety and their journey. The Blackwood family's financial ruin had taught them lessons about empathy and vulnerability that their previous wealth had prevented them from learning, and their quiet support for passenger rights legislation reflected genuine transformation rather than public relations management of their reputational damage. Theodore's experience working in retail sales had educated him about the dignity that every person deserves in service interactions regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. Carter Fleming's federal conviction had sent a clear message throughout corporate America that executives who betrayed fiduciary responsibilities and orchestrated criminal conspiracies would face consequences that extended far beyond simply losing their jobs and their reputations. The precedent of holding senior executives personally liable for institutional discrimination had created new standards for corporate governance and leadership accountability that protected both shareholders and stakeholders from the costs of executive criminal behavior. Vincent and Zara Chen's partnership had proven that family relationships could be strengthened rather than damaged by shared commitment to principles larger than personal comfort and financial success, and their work had demonstrated that individual trauma could be transformed into institutional change when it was supported by resources, determination, and vision that extended beyond revenge to encompass genuine transformation of systems that had failed to protect human dignity and passenger rights in commercial aviation. But perhaps most importantly, millions of passengers who would never know the Chen family's names now traveled on airlines where their dignity was protected by systems and culture that recognized respectful treatment as a fundamental human right rather than a privilege to be purchased. In transforming their own pain into institutional change, Vincent and Zara had created a legacy that would protect countless future travelers from the humiliation and discrimination that had once been accepted as normal costs of air travel for anyone who didn't possess the wealth and connections necessary to demand accountability from airline personnel and corporate executives. If this story of courage, dignity, and transformation moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice and created extraordinary change that made the world more fair and just for everyone. Share this video with your family and friends because these stories of standing up for what's right need to reach as many people as possible. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when you witnessed or experienced the power of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Your voice matters, and together we can continue building a world where everyone knows they belong wherever they've earned the right to be.